We're here at Zero Book's basement, discussing capital, for another session of Zero Book's basement, discussing capital. And here we have Ernesto. And today, I was going to say today we'll be doing chapter 17, changes of magnitude in the price of labor power and in surplus value. So lots of very exciting stuff there, as an excitement that emanates from the title of the chapter, as you can tell. And here we have Ernesto Vargas, or as he's nicknamed, the real Eliot Rosenstock, or as he's nicknamed, the imaginary, and Conrad Hamilton. So I've been nicknamed the symbolic. But we were just before we're going to hop into the chapter, and we have to do quite a bit of grinding because the formulations in this are very, very important. I don't think there's any way of understanding the transition with respect to the development of the welfare state, in contradistinction to a more traditional immiseration thesis of Marxism, where, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer simply, right? Without examining the formulations here. But before we hop into that, we were just talking a little bit, and I think we're going to come down maybe hopefully at the end of the session and discuss this a bit more too. But we were talking a little bit about the some of the protests that are going on. So Ernesto was about to regale us with a story about some of the protests in Mexico, which are occurring now.
Yeah, sure.
Protests and riots, we should say.
Oh, yeah. Riots? Riots?
So let me just start, right before you start. We were talking before the stream, and I was telling him about LA, and Ernesto was telling me about how they're different where he's at right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I'll take it away. Yeah. It's okay. Okay, so here in Mexico, we have a left-wing president, right? And for example, instead of doing corporate bailouts, he actually taxed companies. So Walmart and FEMSA, which is the Coca-Cola parent company, they had to pay about 8 billion pesos in taxes like last week, right? So there's a lot of unrest from the conservative side here in Mexico, right? So yesterday we had a protest on our town square. Of course, there has to be social distancing and everything. And I understand that in the United States, you guys also had this kind of right-wing protest where a bunch of conservatives got together and manifested that they have a right to go back to work, right? A right.
Well, they were protesting the whole, social distancing and protective orders. It's a very brain dead protest over here.
Yeah. We're having much similar thing going on here, and so what these conservatives did is they organized a caravan, right? So they just lined up their cars in a little caravan and drove down the street, and that was a protest. Nothing else.
Okay. Yeah. So very comparatively orderly and civil, we should say.
A bit of a joke, really. I think conservatives here really don't know how to organize. I would say I'm jealous, but I prefer not having conservatives with guns out on the street.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's understandable. But it's interesting that you say that conservatives in Mexico are poor at organizing. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you mean to suggest, because when you said the president's left wing, you mean center left, really.
Of course,
right? So sort of neoliberal left. Now, I know a lot of people have said that it's been speculated or claimed that in many countries, the agents of neoliberalization were more the center left than the right, even. So when you say that the conservatives in Mexico are poorly organized, are you drawing a distinction perhaps between people who identify explicitly with the political right and people who advocate neoliberalism in general?
No, I guess I would specify people who align with the political right, because of course we aren't out of neoliberalism at all in Mexico.
You're what? Sorry, could you repeat?
Yeah, we aren't really out of neoliberalism in Mexico at all. Even if we have a center-left president, as you say, he's really just a proponent of neoliberal policies, just more progressive ones. Yeah,
and it seems to me that it's because if you think of things like NAFTA and the various trade agreements that have been signed, it seems to me that and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that in a way in Mexico there's been a very aggressive and unchecked expansion of neoliberalism. Is partly accreditable to its American influence.
Definitely. And our president says that he's fighting against that, but what he's really fighting against is just corruption in the neoliberal order. He isn't really restructuring it at all. He's just making sure that whoever's getting the contracts is actually delivering the goods. Because, well, of course, you guys have neoliberalism too in your governments, and corruption as well. But at least your hospitals are well stocked, right?
Yeah. Well, and that owes to how neoliberalism plays out, right? Because, it's interesting, like if you look at, I think probably the country that has, there's different examples we could give, but maybe the country that's profited the most, right? From, forms of trade liberalization is ironically China. But in China, you see that there's actually a very, very elaborate system of capital controls that exist. So to make sure that at the very least, Chinese companies or business people, party members, and so on, are the beneficiaries, right? The domestic economy are beneficiaries. Yeah. But if you look at Africa, we see I think between 40 and 50% of manufacturing capital being foreign owned, right? And more specifically, European and North American owned, across the continent. So this is part of the problem, right? If you just, and again, look at how successful Germany and Japan were. Right, to be successful, you have to have domestic companies.
Yeah, of course.
And the risk of that kind of liberalization that's unaccompanied by stringent capital controls is that foreign corporations just move in and take things over, and you're paying rents to countries that are richer than you. Right?
Yeah. What?
Well, I was going to say, would you say that that's an issue in Mexico?
Definitely, yeah. Here in the north of Mexico, which is the most conservative part of the country, almost all of our developments are foreign owned, and we have a big contamination problem here in the north. Of course, the capital has a big contamination problem too, for the same reasons, because it's the capital of the country, right? But here in the north, we are one of the more important veins of the railways, of the continental railways, right? So we have a lot of foreign businesses that are parked here. Over to the east of my city, there's a whole development called Apodaca, which is just full of industrial parks. And it would be nice if those industrial parks were developed and owned by local businesses, but they aren't. They're giant factories that are foreign businesses. And there's a lot of political disagreement in Mexico that here in the north we produce the most wealth. But really, it's because those companies perform the biggest transactions over here in the north. It's not that we're actually producing wealth for the country.
Yeah. Well, and there's a weird aspect of this, right? Like when you say, because people say free markets, right? But very often, if you look at the practical consequence of free markets, right? A lot of it will be, pushing individual gas station owners out of business and replacing them with, a sort of universal chain. And of course, when that kind of monopolization occurs, then you also have the opportunity to greatly raise the price of goods, right? So we see this all over, so for example, the smartphone market was, I would say, relatively monopolized, especially prior to the rise of Huawei more recently. But you saw, because it was first world companies, that were making the vast majority of these phones, that they were able to maintain price points that were outrageous and very hard for a lot of people in poor countries to afford, right?
Yeah, of course. Coffee.
Yeah,
Starbucks. We just started getting waves of Tim Hortons here in Mexico.
Oh, really? That's happening. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah,
what I know about Tim Hortons is that's a Canadian donut chain, by the way.
That's what I mentioned.
You have Tim Hortons?
Yeah.
You have Tim Hortons, Ernesto?
Yeah. I tried Timbits last year.
We don't have Tim Hortons.
They didn't seem to succeed in their European expansion strategy, because I noticed that I believe in Europe there's one Tim Hortons in London.
Okay.
So yeah, they got that one beachhead, but they never really moved past it. So.
No, they're getting popular here.
Okay. Yeah, that was actually founded Tim Hortons. Sorry.
Ender Wiggins says, Ernesto, remember when they gave away land to that Korea car company?
Yes, to Kia. Yes, to Kia. Yeah, they did that. Our governor, Jaime Rodriguez Calderon, alias El Bronco, he gave. Sorry.
That name, holy shit! Yes.
Oh, we all have very fancy names. But El Bronco gave away land to Kia, to a Korean car company. And not only that, but he gave them free use of water for 100 years.
No.
Why? Why do that? I don't even know why, but they have a whole 100 years of capital production where they can use water however they want.
Yeah, it's
Like unlimited.
Supposedly, that's the contract.
It's crazy when you read about these things. I was in Tunisia, and so Tunisia didn't have, a revolutionary partition with France like Algeria did. So in 1956, they negotiated independence with France. Of course, there was agitation, but it was ultimately negotiated. And part of this sort of negotiated settlement involved giving certain privileges to French companies. So I believe, I forget the details, but there was like some kind of, I don't know if it was tin mines or it was some kind of mining operation. And French companies were given preferential rights to certain resources for like a century after independence as part of the condition of independence itself. Right? It's crazy.
Yeah, and their wing corrected me. It was the previous governor, Rodrigo Medina, not El Bronco. But, El Bronco did a lot of the same stuff. He just, I would say he hit it better, but he's getting blasted because he tried running for president. So he's in a tough spot right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's crazy, right? It's crazy that like Chinese socialists have been the ones that like seem to have, achieved the greatest level of acuity. And it's a large population block, so they have a bit more, a mass for productions. They have a bit more weight to throw around that way,
of course,
which makes a big difference. Africa is not unified and so on. But it's interesting that they've developed, let's say, I would argue, the most acute policies in terms of navigating the perils and pitfalls, associated with third world globalization. Right?
Yeah. I will say that Obrador, our president, he says that he plans to implement much more progressive policies, but that he's keeping them close to his chest right now. Okay. That's what he says he's doing, because
I wonder why.
I know, right? But what can I say? I mean, I can at least hope for the better, because if we had gotten, for example, any of the other two conservative candidates, we would be having the same situation as the United States and as Brazil, right? We would be in total chaos. We'd probably have protests, actual left-wing protests, which might be nice also, but it's the day we'll live in, I guess.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can roll around and talk about the riots and stuff at the end when we move through some of the chapter, because we got some important stuff to talk about here. So I mean, one of the things just to get with this chapter, right? Chapter
17.
Chapter 17, yeah. Changes of magnitude in the price of labor power and in surplus value. We have to, the first thing we do, so, a lot of it deals with, I think, the way you have to separate out different sets of terms, right? So one very, very important distinction that has to be made is between price and value, right? Whereas, goods do not necessarily sell at their value, including labor power itself, right? But here, you see, so it's very, very important to keep in mind, right? Especially when you get to, volume 3, like the distinction between price and value becomes very important. But here, so we have to look at the assumptions Marx makes in this section. So he says here in the second paragraph that I assume in this passage that 1, that commodities are sold at their value, and 2, that the price of labor power occasionally rises above its value, but never sinks below it, right? So these are assumptions he's making for essentially heuristic purposes. But again, as we'll see in volume 3, as regard commodities selling at their value, and as can be observed in different parts of capital, that is not at all necessarily the case, right? Because especially when you get, the whole argument, the sort of unfinished quasi-transformation argument of the third volume is that there's an equalization of the rate of profit across different industries that basically causes prices to be decoupled from value, right? Which again creates a big problem, because it's like, what's the point of value if price just decouples from it nearly automatically? I guess the ultimate message of it, right, is if you were to take you would find a parallel between price and value if you took all prices and compared them with all values, right? But they're not. Again, the distribution isn't necessarily 1-to-1 in any given instance.
Yeah, and also Marx mentions that they also vary from country to country, so it's pretty hard to analyze in that sense, right?
Yeah, it gets very complicated. But yeah, another really important distinction in this chapter, right, is between productivity and value, right? So again, you have the one distinction between price and value, that sort of disarticulation, but you have a similar thing going on, which is actually dug into in this chapter, between productivity and value. So again, ultimately, value is related to socially necessary labor time, right? So the labor in the amount of labor time that's required in any given context to produce a good, right? But that's like that is susceptible to change depending on broad changes in productivity, and isolated changes in productivity can actually manifest as value creation, provided that they're not just in conformance with the general rule, right?
Yeah.
So these are again, this is like pretty complicated stuff, but maybe if we turn to page 657, we can get a crack here. So he quotes, I guess, so in the Principles of Political Economy, Ricardo says, there can be no rise in the value of labor without a fall of profits. So it says here that this could be reformulated in Marxist terms as, there can be no rise in the value of labor power without a fall in surplus value, right? So what he wants to go on, like, this is the problem, is of course that Ricardo doesn't actually separate surplus value and profit, right? Because surplus value has to be translated into profit, and the particular translation, the formula for that is provided in the third volume of Capital, right? But they're not 1-to-1. So another distinction we have to make, right, between surplus value and profit, right? But yeah, you see here, can I just read this? I think it'll help.
Yeah, the Ricardo quote. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just want to read could I read this paragraph here on 657?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, about profit and surplus value, right?
Yeah, in formulating the law, where he references Ricardo.
In
formulating the law, Ricardo overlooked one thing. Although a change in the magnitude of the surplus value, or surplus labor, causes a change in the opposite direction in the magnitude of the value of labor power, or in the quantity of necessary labor, it by no means follows that they vary in the same proportion. So let's just see here. Magnitude of value or surplus labor. A change in the magnitude of the surplus value or surplus labor causes a change in the opposite direction of the magnitude of the value of labor power, or in the quantity of necessary labor. Okay. It is true that they increase or diminish by the same quantity, but the proportional increase or diminution depends on their original magnitude before the change in the productivity of labor took place. If the value of the labor power is 4 shillings, or the necessary labor time is 8 hours, and the surplus value is 2 shillings, or the surplus labor 4 hours, and if, owing to an increase in the productivity of labor, the value of the labor power falls to 3 shillings, or the necessary labor time to 6 hours, the surplus value will rise to 3 shillings, or the surplus labor to 6 hours. So again, what we see here, he says here, if owing to an increase in the productivity of labor, the value of the labor power falls to 3 shillings, or the surplus value. Yeah. So if the if the value of the labor power falls, right, because of an increase in productivity, right?
Surplus value.
Yeah, the surplus value is going to rise, right? In accordance.
It makes me think of the protests a little bit. This imaginary register for a second. With the increase in people power, you'll get the decrease in the state power. I think, in terms of if it's people against the state. I think we're seeing that right now.
Yeah.
Just in terms of as soon as the groups who are outside of the state rise in power, I'm seeing the tendency. Every state group is sort of falling in power. I think it's an interesting mechanism. I think it's exportable that Marx is outlining here.
Yeah, it does seem that the state has to recur to. Sorry.
not to get too off topic, but
No. On that same vein, I feel that following the same example, I will guess that the police now have to recur to advances in technology to match the majority of the masses now, right? To their violence.
I don't think they will.
No, but they have. They're shooting rubber bullets.
Have they? Oh yeah. Well, that's not new technology. Rubber bullets. And
I mean, superiority in technology, in sense of controlling the space, right? Because sure, the people are exerting control.
As Bain said, do you feel in control?
Yeah.
Of the space.
Yeah. That's yeah. I agree with that too.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay, Conrad.
I was just gonna say here, like, I don't have that much to say, but I was just gonna say that. So what he's critiquing here is Ricardo's supposition that the change in the magnitude of the surplus value or surplus laser causes a change in the opposite direction in the magnitude of the value of labor power, or in the quantity of necessary. So what he's trying to say is that those changes aren't necessarily proportional, right? Because if you skip down to the next part, right, he says that it depends on the original magnitudes in question.
Yeah.
Right. The value of the labor power falls from 4 shillings to 3. I.e., it falls by 1/4 or 25%. But the surplus value rises from 2 shillings to 3. I.e., it rises by 1/2 or 50%. So in fact, there's a relationship between the two terms, like the value of the labor power and the surplus value, but it's not an equal ratio in terms of their change, right? It's not a same proportional change. So that's what he's saying, that Ricardo, like, often he says, like, much of this chapter here is just trying to scientize some of the propositions put forward by Ricardo, right? So Ricardo's big thing was like, he was obsessed with, it was like a lot of it was like an attack on aristocratic rentiers, right? Because he felt that, by charging, by not actually being productive, right? By not actually creating a good, by charging rents, they were driving up the costs for corporations to function and inhibiting the actual rise of capitalism. And Marx has some words for that later in the chapter. So Marx ultimately he questions that at how legitimate that perceived pattern was, but he still acknowledges that this drove Ricardo to delve into the science of political economy in a way that other people hadn't. Yeah, right. So again, he wants to explore some of these things. So that's a technical point, but I think it's an important point. I'm gonna dig here 1 second. Oh, here we go. So on page 659, we have some interesting stuff, right? So the value of labor power is determined by the value of a certain quantity of means of subsistence, right? So again, we see this relationship between the value of labor power and the subsistence the worker requires to live, right? And that's the basis of Ricardo's critique, by the way, because he was critiquing rents, right, in terms of what rent represented for the means of subsistence, right? So Marx writes, now, if the productivity of labor were to be doubled without any alteration in the ratio between necessary labor and surplus labor, there would be no change in the magnitude either of the surplus value or of the price of labor power. The only result would be that each of these would represent twice as many use values before, and that each use value would be twice as cheap before. Okay, product labor in ratio to surplus labor, be no change. Okay, yeah. So, like, what he's saying is that there could be a theoretical situation in which the productivity of labor was increased without changing the ratio, as he says here, between necessary and surplus labor, right? And that this would not have any effect other than just to create more use values, to create more goods, right? It would just be sort of a frictionless increase in productivity, right?
Yeah, kind of a Keynesian point of view.
Yeah, but here he points out something else, right? He says, so, like, although labor power would be unchanged in price, it would have risen above its value. So it would have risen above its value as in the previous value, right? The real question of whether it would have risen above its value in the current situation would depend on whether this was an isolated or a generalized expression, right? This lower price would still represent an increased quantity. So, but then he makes another point, right? He says, however, now assume a fall in the price of labor power, not as far as 1 shilling 6, 6
pence.
okay, 1 shilling 6 pence, 2 shillings 10 pence, or 2 shillings 6 pence, this lower price would still represent an increased quantity of means of subsistence. So again, like what he's saying here is there can be like a relationship, right, between the fall of labor power, right, and the increasing availability of means of subsistence, right. So in other words, even if let's say the price of labor power were to fall, right, that if goods were all cheaper, right, you could still have a situation in which you're actually able to buy more stuff, right.
Yeah.
In this way, it is possible, given increasing productivity of labor, for the price of labor power to fall constantly, and for this fall to be accompanied by a constant growth in the mass of the workers' means of subsistence. And this we should talk about. Give you a practical example. This is very, very important, because you know, I think one thing that you saw in the United States, right, was because of you know, for example, automation, right, and combined with you know, an unwillingness to decrease the length of the work week, right. In sort of the post-Reagan era, right? That I think what you saw is that there was a fall in the value of labor power, right? But that the actual, or in other words, I should say, in any case, that people were being paid less, and that was actually made up for partly because of the access to cheap goods manufactured in China, right? So the lowering of the price of the means of subsistence, right, was actually able to offset like a diminution in the value of labor power that manifested in lower payment for labor, right?
Yeah.
And people, you know, and that's one of the big, you know, everybody, of course, you know, the very, very rickety arrangement that was reached was that a lot of people, like people who used to have better jobs in industry, moved into service sectors, right? And that's part of the problem now with coronavirus, is that service sectors are hit so hard by the coronavirus that very precarious arrangement, right, is now, you know, showing itself as untenable in some ways. Does anyone have any thoughts on those parts there? Any thoughts?
Well, I was gonna mention that I feel that this also spreads beyond the border, in the sense that you guys are, well, you're Canadian, right, Conrad? Okay, but Eliot and all other American citizens are fighting for a $15 minimum wage per hour, right?
Yeah.
Here in Mexico, the minimum wage is $8 a day, right? So, but we live in the same continent, right? And, you know, kilometers apart in some senses. But the big difference is that
literally kilometers apart as well.
Yeah, exactly. So what you see a lot is that, of course, immigration, in the sense that people go, they get, even if it's $10 an hour, that's still, you're working in 1 hour, the wage of an entire day here in Mexico, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of the way in which this is sustained is because our cost
it's a pretty big incentive to illegally cross the border, one might say.
It's a huge incentive. So
yeah,
it's, you know, if that isn't in control, it's not going to stop. Anyway, but how is it sustained here? Because not everyone can go and get your wages, and of course our minimum wage is logical with our conditions. It's just that our means of subsistence are much cheaper, so you can get an entire month of groceries for about, I don't know, $150, right? Which is something that I'm sure you can also do in the United States, but I'm just trying to use it as an example, right? I don't know how much a month's worth of groceries is in the United States.
What would that be, Eliot? In France, it's in the States, it's cheaper than France, I think.
Depends.
Yeah.
It depends on what you eat.
yeah, definitely.
Eat cup of noodles is cheaper than if
yeah. I'm sure I could get a $10 grocery trip, but
I pay maybe I mean,
very wild for myself.
I pay maybe 300 euros a month in groceries here, which is like $300 US for myself. So, you know, and I just eat a lot of, you know, I eat like you know, popsicles and like you know, macaroni and cheese and like chili you heat up and stuff, just garbage like that. but you know, it's actually a tough thing because like, you know, this is another thing about home economics, I guess. Like, you know, a lot of people are like, oh, well, you'd save money if you cook. Well, like, I'm sure that's true, but at the same time, like the savings associated with the economy of self-prepared food are not as great for an individual as they are for a group of people.
That's right. That's right.
So that becomes very logical. Like if you have a family, especially a large family, it would become enormously expensive to like purchase food individually for everyone in this way. But when you're one person, right, it's like, and then there's the other issue where like, if you make like, something, for you to consume it before it goes bad, you just have to eat the same thing for,
Yeah.
So that does not fall equally everywhere, right? But the thing about the means of subsistence is important to keep in mind. Like this chapter, I think part of the real importance of this chapter is that, like the post-war era, like the mid 20th century and the post-war era, really showed that, at least in the West, that capitalism didn't have to progress in conformance with the immiseration thesis, right? So that capitalism could continue under conditions in which the majority of people, it had a decidedly higher standard of living, right?
Well, yes, but that was because of the world market, I would think.
Yeah. Well, and all that has to be discussed, but I mean, just at the level of the means of subsistence, right? Like, if we look at, a country like Italy, if we look at, the massive period of industrialization and development that it went through, like many countries, in the mid-century and immediately post-war. I mean, part of the reason that you're able to maintain this capitalistic dispensation is because there's just the production of more use values.
Yeah.
Right. So you can still be, extracting surplus value from workers, right? But you're able to make the actual money you pay them go further, right? So I just stress that because I think it's very common to cite the aspect of like social insurance as being quite decisive, right? And certainly it is. But I also think we have to look at the overall production of use values and productivity, right, in a society. So that'd be my point about that. Yeah. And the world market, of course, like very, very important. I think like I'd have to double check it, but I know some theorists have argued that like at a certain point, capitalism essentially sustains itself through like extracting flows of capital from the third world, right? And this is the way, like you could argue that this is the way like the tendency, the rate of profit gets staved off, right?
It does feel that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Sorry, continue.
I was gonna cite an example that some of the thing that tends to happen is that it actually happened here in Mexico. A foreign company, an American company, a railway, it was bought off by the government, right? But the government allowed the Americans to continue to run it and to continue to extract resources. So we didn't really get much from that, and that came from a corrupt deal. That was, I don't know, maybe 1850, 1880, around the time Porfirio Diaz, which was a dictator of Mexico. But yeah, my point is that what I see happening a lot is that I see American companies, continental companies in general, go to the third world, invest there, crash there, get bailed out there, and then bring those bailouts back home.
Yeah. Well, and in any case, they're bringing like a considerable amount of profit or value back home. I mean, on one side you have overt corruption, which is like legitimately a huge issue in a lot of these countries. On the other side, you have the fact that in a lot of cases, if you're dealing with recently emancipated post-colonial states and so on, a lot of them lack the expertise or the actual industrial development.
Definitely
to engage in these things themselves. So the line between corruption and general historical susceptibility can be a very fine one in that respect, right? Which is why it's why China is so hell-bent on the development of national capital.
Correct.
Right? Because whether it and they've become a lot more lax as regards to whether it's Chinese privately owned companies or public infrastructure. But I think the idea would be that the importance is actually in having that developmental capacity. So you're not dependent on Western companies.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And you see a lot of people in third world countries that advocate for that because they see that on paper, the numbers check out, right? It is more profitable to export national resources than to develop them with your shitty industry. That's definitely true. But if you don't invest on your shitty industry, that's never going to change.
Yeah, well, this is why China has actually been able to develop while running at like negative rates of profit.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because like the whole, and it's like this kind of stands to reason. I mean, like, if you really want to pursue a program like that, you have to sort of disregard rates of profit to a degree.
Definitely.
Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, to give you a very, very schematic example, right? Like, if you were given a loan, like by the government, right? And and of course states have, especially large states like China have, relatively flexible access to capital loans. But if you were to it would be stupid not to go do something like buy an apartment building.
Of course.
Right. Because you're going to make way more money in the long run. Right. But like you're still going to lose money in the short run. That's almost certain. Right.
Right.
But like, the thing is like companies, right. We're seeing now with COVID, right. Like how, kind of limited the temporality of capitalism is in its functioning.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like, if things come to a halt for like a month, it's like, it's fucked. Right.
Yeah. I'm seeing that a lot here also.
Yeah. So I just mean that private companies, aren't, normally don't have access to the same kind of credit, nor do they have this sort of stability and longevity that allows them to totally ignore something like short-term rates of profit.
Right? They pretend they do.
Well, okay, they make investments, if that's what you mean. Like any process through which like you invest, you're putting forth capital involves such an investment, right? But like the idea with that is that like there's going to be a cycle of production which you get a return, right? It doesn't tend to be like, oh well, 1 million cycles of production from now, right?
Yeah,
then,
exactly.
I guess if you get companies that are big enough, and today, really with monopoly capital, then they can start to think a little bit more state-like, in terms of how they function. So, yeah. Any thoughts on that, Eliot?
I was just thinking about like, I was actually just thinking, I was like, I feel like I'm one of the watchers here. I'm just like, well, this is interesting. Yeah. Well, national industry is interesting because I was watching CGTV and I was watching China, The Economist, and some of it's interesting and some of it kind of sounds like just neoliberalism but more effective. And I think you really have to have the economic foundation, and it's starting to see like with these protests and with everything like that, like without the socialist state, it would be extraordinarily difficult, if not entirely impossible, to have that sort of perspective on an official policy level, right? In terms of the, I don't know what Ernesto, maybe the Latin American non-one-party states are doing that to a certain degree, but I'm not sure. Do you know?
Doing what, Eliot, exactly?
Developing the national sort of industry rather than, or is it rather than exporting, right? Or no?
Here in Mexico, Obrador is trying very heavily to do 3 very important things. He's trying to set up an hydroelectric plant. I'm sorry. He's trying to kick our refineries back into full production. He's trying to set up an industrial railway all the way down to the south, like a major railway, because we have a railway, but it's minor. So yeah, and he's trying to do all that through the national infrastructure.
Okay, so it is possible in an electoral system to some extent to do those things.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think that I mean the issue isn't so much like I think the issue of the electoral system is more secondary to the overall question.
Yeah.
The question really concerns what we call economic freedom, which often is just a stand-in for the notion that it's sort of carte blanche and any Western company can come in and buy up things and so on. And the problem is like that has knock-on effects on the political structure. Right?
True.
So if you have a highly accessible, right, and one might say susceptible political system, and then you have this operative principle of economic freedom, and you're going to the table as a weakened position, right? It's very, very easy to wrest control of the economy than to wrest control of the political system piece by piece. Right?
That's very true. I wouldn't see that happening in the United States. Corporate power there is centered there. Sorry?
I was just thinking that because there's so much incentive to import and to, like you said, recapture the flows of third world nations due to that massive disparity in labor power and the surplus value extracted from it. Right. So in terms of the U.S., it would almost be a non sequitur for the U.S. to start doing that unless you really had some economically woke. Like, it's totally unlikely. Yeah.
Well, this also gets us to a good point. And by the way, the last thing I was going to say, and Zizek, when I was in Slovenia, Zizek said this, but apparently the last thing, Deng Xiaoping, who liberalized large sectors of the Chinese economy whilst maintaining capital controls, apparently the last thing he said in his deathbed is he's like, I have some things I want to, I want to reflect a little bit on the policies that I've pursued in China. He said, what I really feel about, the political system is that I was right to not liberalize it. His last words, right? And I think I kind of understand the idea, because I guess the idea is that like the inaccessibility of the political system is the only thing that can effectively serve as a check, right? Against the threat of getting in a situation where you're paying extensive foreign rents, right?
Definitely, yeah.
So that, again, like I think when people talk about like Chinese totalitarianism or whatever, it's like, and I'm not here to like excuse like every sort of like appalling thing that's done.
Hi, Conrad.
Hey. I think they often speak without any real understanding of the underlying economic motives that drive that structure. Or how that could be good. Like, so it's like, like in 2000, I think it was 2002, there was 320 million Chinese in poverty by global standards. And in 2019, there was 19 million in poverty, right?
Yeah. Certainly there's the benefit for the non-liberalization is being reaped by China. I worry, like, it's like being a therapist, I sort of have Peterson syndrome, which well, maybe not you, Ernesto. I don't mean to insult you. But in terms of, I think in terms of like personal utility, in terms of the effects of sort of mass surveillance on your population and extraordinarily like overcoding speech. I think eventually there's something about that's going to come to a head, or not, or it could maintain just because the state power is so strong. But I really think that's like the mental strain on the citizens, who are just regular Chinese citizens, not people in Hong Kong, who I've heard describe it as essentially, it's like, what's it like growing up in China? It's like hell, essentially. And that's not a bourgeois take necessarily. It's just the psychological response of the highly overcoded nature of the system.
Well, I think that is true, and I think it's going to be hard to maintain. Now, I'm not saying China is going to become like, some spectacular Western liberal democracy or anything like that. But I do think that forms of democratization will be hard to resist, because I think one thing is that I think that so many people have increased their level of education. Right. So many people have, become enriched that I think they become more meaningful stakeholders in the society. And I think the truth right now is that the Chinese Communist government gets away with a lot because economic growth has been so remarkable. Whereas I think that as soon as that slows down, and it will slow down, like you can't grow it, 10% year over year indefinitely. Right. They're diminishing.
Well, they've already officially announced that that's no longer what they'll be doing. Right. Xi already announced they're no longer going to meet that target.
Well, and it makes sense, right? Because they're trying to normalize that politically, right? But it goes to show. I think that it seems entirely predictable to me that there will have to be a partial democratization of. I mean, look, China already has certain democratic mechanisms. We shouldn't be naive, but that there will have to be a heightened democratization of China that coincides with, the dropping off of economic growth, right? Because of how many people have been enabled and I think are able to participate meaningfully in a democratic fashion. So how peaceful that will be, or how it will play out. I don't know. But I think at this point, we probably shouldn't doubt the versatility of the Chinese Communist Party. Right.
Well, yeah, certainly they have like carte blanche to move China wherever they want. So
yeah. Well, so
although,
what I mean,
although the current surveillance state, there's so many apparatuses, and that's so intrinsically linked with their policy. I don't see that going away necessarily. Their approach to it could, though. Their approach could change. So even if they do have the hyper surveillance, right now I think they're doing the same thing that they do with weapons, which is, as Xi says, the Communist Party must show that its strength and must display their weapons, and they're displaying the surveillance technology. I think that can change if they want to do that. At some point, who knows? Yeah.
Well, I think in some sense, like mass surveillance is the future of our world, isn't it? Right. I think the real question is,
it's a general tendency.
What form will it take on? Right.
Yeah.
And that it could be more or less overt or more or less invasive in China. But I think that's going to depend a lot on how popular struggle plays out at that level. And actually, this gives us a good. We can go back and look at the question of means of subsistence as well as regards China. Right? Because a lot of the manufacturing they've been doing is for foreign markets, but predictably one consequence of this is that the increase in the production of use values is going to cheapen the means of subsistence for Chinese workers as well, right? Which is another way that you're able to appease people in the context of a society in which more, not less, surplus value is being extracted, right? So again, like obviously in China, like a much greater share of what workers produce is being extracted as surplus value today than in the past when we didn't have widely developed private industry, right? But the explosion in productivity has been so enormous at the same time, right? It's like I think very few people in China, probably some, but not so many, have the sense of being poorer than they would have been a few decades ago, right?
Yeah, in China, definitely.
Yeah, dignity notwithstanding as a as a question, but.
Well, also the workday is longer in China as well. It's like a different.
Oh yeah, is it 10 hours a day now, or?
Yeah, in 6 days a week. It can't. It gets around there. Yeah.
Well, the goal isn't just that's interesting, right? Because you have a lot of Western investors, so the goal isn't just productivity, right? Again, differentiating between productivity and value. It's also maintaining a high profit rate, which means that. There has to be a higher proportion of variable capital, right? So what I mean is that in a way it makes sense because like Marx will argue, time and time again that, it's often the case that lowering the length of the work week or the work day can have constructive implications in terms of encouraging automation and so forth and actually driving activity. But that's not just the problem. That's not just the question. Right.
Well, Marx also writes, it's like, if you shorten the workday, the tendency of labor to sort of match its value to the price to sort of roughly follow value to some extent. That if you shorten the workday with still the surplus, what does he say exactly? It's sort of at the end of the chapter.
Yeah.
But the general idea is you can't just decide willy-nilly to shorten the workday with all the mechanisms at work necessarily, because it will create a change in the intensity of labor.
He says it. I found the quote. Do you want me to read it?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, it says the more the productivity of labor increases, the more the working day can be shortened, and the more the working day is shortened, the more the intensity of labor can increase. From the point of view of society, the productivity of labor also grows when economies are made in its use. This implies not only economizing on the means of production, but also avoiding all useless labor. The capitalist mode of production, while it enforces economy in each individual business, also begets, by its anarchic system of competition, the most outrageous squandering of labor power and of the social means of production, not to mention the creation of a vast number of functions at present indispensable, but in themselves superfluous. And then he says, Yeah, he says the intensity of and productivity of labor being given, the part of the social working day necessarily taken up with material production is shorter. And as a consequence, the time at society's disposal for free intellectual and social activity of the individual is greater, in proportion as work is more and more evenly divided among all the able-bodied members of society. And a particular social stratum is more and more deprived of the ability to shift the burden of labor, which is a necessity imposed by nature, from its own shoulders to those of another social stratum. The absolute minimum limit to the shortening of the working day is, from this point of view, the universality, Allgemeinheit, of labor. In capitalist society, free time is produced for one class by the conversion of the whole lifetime of the masses into labor time.
Yeah. So, I mean, as regards
I'll
what
be
Eliot...
back. I need to-
Sorry?
sorry.
His bathroom, I think.
Yeah, I'll be back in a second.
Yeah. As regards what Eliot was saying, I think his point was that you can't, like, if you're going to shift the length of the workday, that, ideally it would be done alongside changes in productivity.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That you can't just, and those changes also have to be distributed somewhat through ideally, they should be distributed throughout an economy as well.
Mm-hmm.
For that to become a more general tendency. Right.
Yeah, it was actually in the previous chapter. My bad. But yeah, he mentions it right here, that he says that which is now surplus labor would then account as necessary labor, the time that was cut away, because he also talks a lot about the political project of communism, I would say, here, and he also adds a little bit of politics in general in this chapter, and he discusses, for example, that the price of labor time might fall, but it might not fall all the way, depending on how much the laborer can struggle.
Yeah. The length of the working. So I'm just going over. I'm looking at section 3 here on page 662.
Mm-hmm.
The working day creates a greater or lesser amount of value. Okay. Every change in the relation between the magnitude of surplus value and the value of labor power arises from a change in the absolute value. Okay. The absolute value of labor power can change only in consequence of the reaction exercised with the prolongation of surplus labor power. The cause in the absolute value is therefore the effect, but never the cause. A shortening of the working day. Okay, so do you mind if I read? I just want to read point 1 from section 3, page 662. So the second point 1 that appears near the end of the page. We begin with the case in which the working day is shortened. A shortening of the working day under the conditions given, i.e. with the productivity and the intensity of labor constant, leaves the value of labor power and therefore the necessary labor time as it was before. It reduces the surplus labor and the surplus value. Along with the absolute magnitude of the latter, its relative magnitude also falls, i.e. its magnitude in relation to the magnitude of the value of labor power, which remains constant. Only by reducing the price of labor power below its value could the capitalist compensate himself for this fall. All the usual arguments against the shortening of the working day depend on the assumption that the phenomenon occurs under the conditions presupposed here. But in reality, the very opposite is the case. A shortening of the working day either follows upon or immediately precedes a change in the productivity and the intensity of labor. So this is also sort of what Eliot was saying, right? That if you were to would leave the value of labor power and therefore the necessary labor time as it was before. Yeah. So if you were just to shorten the working day without any kind of change in productivity, it would just reduce surplus labor and surplus value.
Yeah, which the capitalist will never allow.
Yeah, which the capitalist doesn't want. So you can't just do that in a vacuum, right?
Mm-hmm.
So can I read 2 here then? Lengthening of the working day?
Yeah, please.
Lengthening of the working day. Let the necessary labor time be 6 hours, or the value of labor power 3 shillings. Also let the surplus labor be 6 hours, or the surplus value 3 shillings. The working day then amounts to 12 hours and is embodied in a value of 6 shillings. If the working day is lengthened by 2 hours and the price of labor power remains the same, the surplus value increases both absolutely and relatively. Although there is no absolute change in the value of labor power, it suffers a relative fall. Under the conditions assumed in 1, there could be a change of relative magnitude in the value of labor power without a change in its absolute magnitude. Here, on the contrary, the change of relative magnitude in the value of labor power is the result of the change of absolute magnitude in the surplus value. Since the value product in which a day of labor is embodied increases with the length of that day, it is evident that the surplus value and the price of labor power may simultaneously increase, either by equal or unequal quantities. Okay. So this is important to pay attention to, right? Here. So I'm just lengthening the working day. So let's just see here. The whole working day then amounts to 12 hours. So this is a value product in which day of labor is embodied increases with the length of that day. Although there's no change in its absolute magnitude here, on the contrary, the change of relative magnitude in the value of labor power. There's also change in the absolute magnitude. So I think, like, wait, if the working days lengthen and the price of labor power remains the same, the surplus value increases. Okay. Yeah, although there is no absolute change in the value of labor power, it suffers a relative fall. So basically, like, I think what he's trying to say here is that if you were not to reduce hours if you were not to reduce hours in accompanying with increased productivity, there'd be no absolute change in the value of labor power, but it would suffer a relative fall, right? Because this is like the whole thing about like the superfluous application of labor, right? It's like you have to identify, right? And this is a contradictory tension within capitalism in terms of relative and absolute surplus value, but you have to identify, like, how much labor time is actually needed, right? For to reach a certain level of productivity, right? So if you just decide to employ labor beyond that, right? This is what he refers to as not an absolute fall in the value of labor power, but a relative fall, right? So effectively, it involves, like, this is what he's saying. Like, if you don't reduce labor time, right, in conjunction with gains in productivity, you'll see a relative fall in the value of labor power because of the way it's being more extraneously applied, right? If that makes sense. So like, very, very simply, I might be vulgarizing this a bit because these are tough. These are tough things to get through. But very simply, it's like, it's like you're creating labor-saving technologies, but then you're not actually using them to save labor, right? So this creates a relative fall in the value of labor power, right? Okay, is that sort of clear? So when the working day is prolonged, the price of labor power may fall below its value, although that price nominally remains the same, although that price nominally remains unchanged or even rises. The value, when the working day is prolonged, the price of labor power may fall below its value, although that price nominally, okay. The value of a day's labor power is estimated, as will be remembered, on the basis of its normal average duration, or the normal duration of the life of a worker, and on the basis of the appropriate normal standard of conversion of living substances into motion, as it applies to the nature of man. Up to a certain point, the increased deterioration of labor power, inseparable from a lengthening of the working day, may be compensated for by making amends in the form of higher wages. But beyond this point, deterioration increases in geometrical progression, and all the requirements for the normal reproduction and functioning of labor power cease to be fulfilled. The price of labor power and the degree of exploitation cease to be commensurable quantities. Okay. So this is again what he's saying here, that, like, I guess he's saying labor power can fall below its value even though the price that's paid for it is remaining unchanged, right? And on the basis of the appropriate normal standard conversion of living substances into motion as applies to the nature of man. Yeah, so what he's saying here also, and this would have been quite relevant to the industrial context, he's also saying that one of the motivations for shortening the hours is so that labor power doesn't deteriorate, right? So keep in mind, like, the heavy requirements of a lot of factory labor at that time, right? Which was a lot of it was quite physically intensive. Still is, right?
Correct.
In certain contexts. Ernesto. So what he's saying here too, right, is there's another thing that's going on, right, which is that you're actually exhausting the labor power itself, right? So he says that at a certain point, like, the deterioration becomes geometric, right, and there's this sort of worsening of it, right? there's still something here. Like there's still like a kind of thread here. Like I just want to go back. There's something I'm trying to understand. Sorry guys, I hope this isn't too.
No, please.
No, I'm listening.
Okay, yeah.
I'm definitely listening. It's interesting and necessary, I think.
If the working day is lengthened by 2 hours and the price of labor power remains the same, the surplus value, okay. There's no absolute change in the value of labor power. Okay. So it's just the absolute and relative dimensions that I'm puzzling over here a little bit. So let the necessary labor time be 6 hours, value of labor power, and also the surplus value. If the working day is lengthened by 2 hours and the price of labor power remains the same, the surplus value increases. Okay. Although there's no absolute change in the value of labor power, it suffers a relative fall. Okay. If we no change, under the conditions, if we no change in the relative magnitude, the change in absolute magnitude. The change of relative magnitude in the value of the labor power is the result of the change of absolute magnitude. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think we're getting. I think we did a fair. I went over it. Like I could go over this a bit more, but I think we had a fair summary of some of the contents here. So we go to section 4. It's obvious that a large number of combinations are possible here. Any two of the factors may vary, and the third remains constant, or all three may vary at once. So I guess here is he going to delineate? These are okay. The three things. Okay. So he's going back to the earlier. Like there's a problem here with references in this. So he says 3. He says it's obvious that a large number. So any two of the factors may vary, and the third may remain constant. So I guess that he's going. Those are the 3 things he outlined at the beginning of section 3, right? So the working day creates a greater or lesser amount of value in proportion to its length, thus a variable and not a constant quantity of value. Every change in the relation between the magnitude of surplus value and the value of labor power arises from a change in the absolute magnitude of the surplus labor, and consequently of the surplus value. Okay. The absolute value of labor power can change only in consequence of the reaction exercised by the prolongation of surplus labor upon the wear and tear of labor power. Every change in this absolute value is therefore the effect, whatever the cause of a change in the magnitude of surplus value. So the working day creates a greater or lesser amount of value in proportion to its length, thus a variable and not a constant quantity of value. So like in one, he's saying that there's a variability because it depends on productivity. Right? It's indexes to productivity. Right?
The working day creates a greater or lesser amount of value in proportion to its length. Yeah.
Yeah.
Variable.
So you have to compare it to productivity, I guess. Every change in the relation between the magnitude of surplus value and the value of labor power arises from a change in the absolute magnitude of the surplus labor and consequently of the surplus value. So every change in the relation between the magnitude of surplus value and the value of labor power arises from a change in the absolute magnitude of the surplus labor. Okay, so yeah, like surplus value and the value of labor power index to absolute magnitude of the surplus labor and consequently of the surplus value. So here he's discussing the relationship between surplus value, labor power, and surplus labor, right? So he's just clarifying the relationship. The absolute value of labor power can change only in consequence of the reaction exercised by the prolongation of surplus labor upon the wear and tear of labor power. Every change in this absolute value is therefore the effect, but never a cause, of a change in the magnitude of surplus value. So the value of labor power can change only in consequence of the reaction exercised by the prolongation of surplus labor upon the wear and tear. Every change in this absolute value is therefore the effect, but never the cause of a change. So I think there he's talking about the impact of labor on labor power.
Yeah, physical deterioration.
Yeah, physical duration. Yeah. So those are, but then he starts at the next section. He said it's obvious that a large number of combinations are possible here. Any two of the factors may vary, and the third remains constant, or all three may vary at once. Right.
Yes.
So the third, so there's always a level of exhaustion of labor power, right? Physically in the process of production. But like the first two factors he cites as variable, right? So in other words, the working day can be, the relationship of value, like in productivity, like you have to look at the shortening or lengthening of the working day in relation to that. So absolute and relative surplus value have to be taken into consideration. Yeah, and also examining the magnitudes associated with surplus value, labor power, surplus labor. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We good. We got this far. Okay.
Yeah, we're pretty close.
So here he says, so we go to 4.1, diminishing productivity of labor with simultaneous lengthening of the working day. Do you want to read that one, Ernesto or Eliot? Do one of you guys want to read?
I'll read it.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Number 1, diminishing productivity of labor with simultaneous lengthening of the working day. In speaking here of diminishing productivity of labor, we are particularly concerned with those industries whose products determine the value of labor power. We have in mind, for example, diminishing productivity resulting from the decreasing fertility of the soil and from the corresponding increase in the prices of its products. Assume a working day of 12 hours and a value product of 6 shillings, half of which replaces the value of the labor power, the other half forming the surplus value. Then, let a rise in the prices of the product of the soil occur, so that the value of labor power goes up from 3 shillings to 4, and the necessary labor time therefore rises from 6 hours to 8. If the length of the working day remains unaltered, the surplus labor will fall from 6 hours to 4, and the surplus value from 3 shillings to 2. If the day is lengthened by 2 hours, for example, from 12 hours to 14 hours, the surplus labor will remain at 6 hours. The surplus value will remain at 6 shillings, but the relative magnitude of the surplus value will decrease in comparison with the magnitude of the value of labor power, as measured by the necessary labor time. If the day is lengthened by 4 hours, i.e. from 12 hours to 16, the proportional magnitudes of surplus value, and value of labor power of surplus labor and necessary labor will continue unchanged, but the absolute magnitude of surplus value will rise from 3 shillings to 4, and that of the surplus labor from 6 hours to 8, an increment of 1/3 or 33 1/3%. Therefore, with diminishing productivity of labor and a simultaneous lengthening of the working day, the absolute magnitude of surplus value may continue unaltered. At the same time as its relative magnitude diminishes, its relative magnitude may continue unaltered at the same time as its absolute magnitude increases. And finally, if the working day is lengthened to a sufficient extent, both may increase.
Diminishing productivity of labor and the simultaneous lengthening of the work. Do you mind if I just stop?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Go over it
Diminishing
again.
productivity of labor and a simultaneous lengthening of the working day, the absolute magnitude of surplus value may continue unaltered. At the same time as its relative magnitude diminishes, its relative magnitude may continue unaltered at the same time. Okay. Yeah. So when you get into this, it's like, so this is sort of like, everything depends on the mathematical relationship, right? Between productivity, or like the as it impacts the value of labor, and surplus value, right? So let's see. So I'm just looking at this example. A working day of 12 hours and a value product of 6 shillings, half of which replaces the value of the labor power, the other half forming the surplus value. Then let a rise in the price of the products of the soil occur. The value of labor power goes from 3 shillings to 4. Okay, rise in the price. Okay, so labor power now costs more.
Yeah,
necessary labor time therefore goes from 6 hours to 8. If the length of the working day remains unaltered, the surplus labor will fall from 6 hours to 4, and the surplus value from 3 shillings to 2. The day is lengthened, the surplus value will remain. Okay. If the day is lengthened by 4. Okay, so that's not too complicated, right? We're actually going through it, right? It's just that, as the value of labor power changes, you have to adjust the hours accordingly, right? In order to meet subsistence needs and so forth, right?
Yeah.
Then I just want to read a tiny bit here. I'm gonna give it back to you. So in the period between 1799 and 1815, an increase in the prices of the means of subsistence led in England to a nominal rise in wages, although there was a fall in real wages as expressed in the quantity of the means of subsistence they would purchase. From this fact, West and Ricardo drew the conclusion that the diminution in the productivity of agricultural labor had brought about a fall in the rate of surplus value, and they made this assumption, which was purely a product of their own imagination, the starting point of important investigations into the relative magnitude of wages, profits, and ground rent. So again, like diminution in productivity of agriculture connected to changes in ground rent, right? So that's the relationship to the rentier and aristocratic class. But as a matter of fact, surplus value had at that time increased both in absolute and in relative magnitude, thanks to the increased intensity of labor and to the prolongation of the working day, which had been forced upon the workers. This was a period in which the right to prolong the working day without any restriction at all became accepted as one of the basic rights of the citizen. It was also a period especially characterized on the one hand by rapid growth of capital, on the other hand by rapid growth of pauperism.
I like how in Marxist.org they say accelerated accumulation of capital. We have slightly different translation. Anyway.
Yeah.
Are you using the Marxist org? Is that what you said?
Yeah, I am.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, that's
because
the
that way I can that way I can search it and I can throw them on the screen when necessary.
I actually like that translation better than the folks, by the way, the one you have. Like there's some issues with it, but like I feel like the folks it makes a lot of errors. Like the folks is a bit like cleaner, but it makes a lot of errors. Like the Avalon has some advantage in that it was the first and it was directly overseen, I think, by Engels. So I think there's a certain integrity with the Avalon. There's still a better translation to be made for sure. But what we have is not bad, right?
Right.
But here, so drew the conclusion that the domination in the productivity of agriculture had brought about a fall in the rate of surplus value. Okay. But as a matter of fact, surplus value at the time increased both in absolute and relative magnitude, thanks to the increased intensity of labor and to the prolongation of the working day, which was enforced upon the workers. So absolute and relative surplus value had both been simultaneously intensifying, right? Yeah. So that's what we have. But this also, it's interesting about relative magnitude. Yeah. So definitely a direct reference to relative surplus value there. Okay. Do you want to read? I can take the footnote, but does someone want to read the second section here?
Sure.
Okay.
Do I wait for you to go?
Eliot or Ernesto?
I could do it, but it will be the increased intensity. That one.
Increasing intensity.
Yeah. Increased productiveness and greater intensity of labor both have a like effect. They both augment the mass of articles produced in a given time. Both, therefore, shorten that portion of the working day which the laborer needs to produce his means of subsistence or their equivalent. The minimum length of the working day is fixed by this necessary but contractile portion of it. If the whole working day were to shrink to the length of this portion, surplus labor would vanish. A consummation utterly impossible under the regime of capital. Only by suppressing the capitalist form of production could the length of the working day be reduced to the necessary labor time. But even in that case, the latter would extend its limits. On the one hand, because of the notion of, quote, means of subsistence would considerably expand, and the laborer would lay claim to an altogether different standard of life. On the other hand, because a part of what is now surplus labor would then count as necessary labor, I mean the labor of forming a fund for reserve and accumulation. The more productiveness of labor increases, the more the working day can be shortened. And the more the working day is shortened, the more can the intensity of labor increase. Conrad, would you like to interject before I go through this whole thing?
The more the productivity of labor, the more the working day can be shortened. And the more the working day is shortened, the more the intensity of labor can increase. So this is the word. I was searching for this word earlier. Yeah, like this phrase, intensity of labor, right? And that's what I was trying to say earlier, right? Is like if you don't lower the working day in accordance, that you're lowering, you effectively, in accordance with changes in productivity, you're effectively lowering the intensity of labor, right?
Yeah.
Wait, what did you see from? Where were you? Did you just finish that first sentence?
Yeah, I'm on the second paragraph, but I just finished it first.
Okay,
from a social point of view, the productiveness, so I'll just start from the second paragraph and reread that. The more productiveness of labor increases, the more can the working day be shortened, and the more the working day is shortened, more can the intensity of labor increase. From a social point of view, the productiveness increases in the same ratio as the economy of labor, which, in its turn, includes not only the economy of the means of production, but also the avoidance of all useless labor. The capitalist mode of production, while on one hand enforcing economy in each individual business, on the other hand, begets by its anarchical system of competition the most outrageous squandering of labor power and of the social means of production, not to mention the creation of a vast number of employments at present indispensable, but in themselves superfluous. The intensity and productiveness of labor being given, the time which society is bound to devote to material production is shorter, and as a consequence, the time at its disposal for the free development, intellectual and social, of the individual is greater, in proportion as the work is more and more evenly divided among all the able-bodied members of society. And as a particular class is more and more deprived of the power to shift the natural burden of labor from its own shoulders to those of another layer of society. In this direction, the shortening of the working day finds at last a limit in the generalization of labor. In capitalist society, spare time is acquired for one class by converting the whole lifetime of the masses into labor time. All right. Okay. That's that.
So that's interesting. So what he's basically saying here is that there always has to be surplus labor that's being performed under capitalism, right? You can't just perform the necessary labor, right? But there, like, what's interesting here too is, like, when he talks about what communism might represent, he rarely sort of makes these speculations, right? Mm-hmm. But I note two things here on page 667. He says that only in the abolition of the capitalist form of production would permit the reduction of the working day to the necessary labor time. But even that, in that case, the latter would expand to take up more of the day, and for two reasons. First, because the worker's conditions of life would improve and his aspirations become greater. And second, because a part of what is now surplus labor would then count as necessary labor, namely the labor which is necessary to the formation of a social fund for reserve and accumulation. So in other words, there would still need, he's speculating that there would still need a certain kind of surplus labor to be performed to both meet, the heightened material needs. This is sort of your luxury, fully automated luxury. Well, maybe not fully automated, but luxury communist hypothesis here, that there would have to be, a kind of surplus labor that was done for the workers, right? And secondly, that even if you didn't have capitalist control of the means of production, you'd still have to finance the means of production, right? Like there's still operational costs and so forth, right, associated with it. So there has to be, a means through which that's realized.
Could automation produce that surplus labor? Would be the real ticket. Could you automate?
Well, yeah. I mean, these are interesting. Could you automate surplus labor? Only abolition. I mean, see, the thing is, when he says, you have to ask yourself what he's saying when he says necessary time, right? And all that would, because we're not talking about capitalism, right? Right. We're not talking about we're not talking about so it's sort of like, it's the socially necessary labor time in this case to actually create productivity. It's not the socially necessary labor time to create value, right? So that's quite a different thing, because we're not talking about value anymore, right? We're not talking about the value form, right? We're talking about productivity. So all he's saying, right? So yes, theoretically, in response to your question, it could, but that would require machines that were totally self-operational, right? And I think it's very, very difficult.
Also, Conrad, I think it. Should I just talk in my narrator voice? I think I should.
Please.
I don't like to sound like an Angelino when I'm reading Marx. But also Conrad. I think the automation can be within the labor itself, in terms of it reduces the intensity of the labor itself through automation. So it's, like you said, not fully automated necessarily.
Semi-automated.
But I think we covered that in a different chapter, of course, technology and its. Yes, Eliot, use the Chinese news network voice.
Yes, please.
I love that guy. He's so concerned. He does more than the voice, the Chinese news network. So,
Yeah.
well, isn't that? He's like a real.
Well, full automation,
no.
full automation is actually impossible, right? Because there'll always have to be some kind of handmaiden. Like, I mean, you have relatively full automation, right?
Yeah.
That reduces, that would reduce necessary time to almost nothing. But like actual full automation, I would take as a structural impossibility.
Yeah, fair enough.
So people always have to do something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then he's saying that then he's saying they'll have to do a little bit more than that, even, right? Because of the upkeep associated with these things, and then like maybe they'll do a little bit more, just because to further enrich the workers, right? So that's kind of the. But
to avoid the Wall-E scenario.
To avoid the what?
The Wall-E scenario. Remember Wall-E the robot, and then he's all the people. None of the people have to work anymore, so they all have their own lounge chairs and the product. Right?
Yeah. Well, of course, yeah. But even like even frankly to be like it's even hard. It's a little bit hard here. Like this is one of those like kind of Postonian aporias because like it's a little bit hard here. Like he deliberately uses the words labor time, right? But it's always a little bit difficult to speculate as to what labor time would represent outside the context of abstract labor, right? Because like really here we're just talking about well, I mean, it depends how you define abstract labor, right? First of all, because Marx says it's just a quantitative dimension of labor. So I don't know, maybe there's abstract labor in a certain sense under communism. You could argue that way. But my point is that in any case, if we're talking about labor that's not indexed to the form of value, right, then it gets quite abstract to quantify what labor actually is, right? So, this is a bit of a problem in Marx's work is like this distinction between, there's too tidy a distinction between like labor and spare time, right? Which really gets into like, the way that a lot of the time, because like, even in our society, today I said it's very clarifying in a certain way that the value form exists. Then we could say, well, this labor is directly involved in the valorization process, right? But then like, this is what the Italian post-operists focus on a lot is like how, in a way, no matter what we're doing, we're always, in many ways, we're contributing indirectly to the valorization of capital because this whole system is organized that way, right? So if you go edit a page on Wikipedia, it's like that's contributing to the general function of a society in which capital is being reproduced.
Yes.
Right. But all I mean is that it becomes.
You ever just be a counter-revolutionary and edit a Wikipedia article?
Sorry?
You ever just be a counter-revolutionary and edit a Wikipedia article? I edited a Wikipedia article. I really stand for Diplo because he got a satellite radio station, and the people who had it before really didn't like the change. And I made it more objective. I really directly stand for capital. Right?
So I made one on my local baseball team who beat they beat the Boston Red Sox in the 19th century, and they also beat the KKK. So
that's
the KKK
that's worth noting.
The KKK had one of the best baseball clubs. That was just one of the things. Yeah. Big social organization in that time. Yeah. It's true. Yeah.
I mean, baseball is based a lot on having money, right? So makes sense.
The KKK couldn't survive effectively into the age of progressively more racially integrated baseball, right? This is part of the problem, right?
Yeah, I can imagine.
I mean, this is kind of what Marx points out about all that solid belts in there, right? It's like, the drive for valorization and the drive for labor power, casts out or diminishes the importance of these kind of patriarchal differentiations. Right?
Of course, yeah.
Like I'm a business, we're just trying to make money, right? I just want the best baseball players because I want to beat the opponents, right? And then I want to, enlarge the economic size of the franchise, right?
Everything solid melts into air.
But and at the end here we say, okay, work is more actively and evenly distributed. Yeah. So again, so this is another thing too, because people often talk about, fully automated luxury communism. And, Marx, like, I want to note that in Capital, which is Marx's, sort of most definitive work, because he actually, again, I've said this before, but he actually wrote it after the manuscripts for 2 and 3. But in Capital, certainly, it's clear that he thinks of the real possibility of like the elimination of virtually all labor time as being quite speculative. So in the Grundrisse, we have the fragment of machines where he kind of speculates about that. And I think it's quite reasonable to discuss, like in the context of our current level of automation, which is very different than Marx's time. What's also clear is that I think, it's like, it's hard to say exactly what he means, but it seems to me that in these passages, like, now keep in mind how long in his time it had already been reduced, but how relatively long working days were in an industrial context.
Yeah.
I think he's probably imagining a situation in which people are working like 3 or 4 hours a day or something. That's the sense I get from the text, right? So I don't think it's really like that possible in the immediate situation to think like, okay, well, you're gonna go work, you're gonna just like do 5 minutes.
No,
I don't really think that's what he's talking about. Like nothing indicates that, right? But that doesn't mean it's not possible, right?
Sure.
Yeah, it just means it was a bit futuristic in relation to the horizon of what he's discussing. Can I just read this footnote here? It's the last thing we'll do on the nitty gritty of the chapter. Just look at the footnote here on corn.
Yeah.
The 2 footnotes, 7 and 8. Let me. Why don't I read 7 and you take 8, Ernesto? Is that good?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. I think we benefit from reading this one just because it's really it's quite forensic. So it's really
we have to go out there. Sorry.
Corn and labor rarely march quite abreast, but there's an obvious limit beyond which they cannot be separated. With regard to the unusual exertions made by the laboring classes in periods of dearness, which produce the fall of wages noticed in the evidence, they are most meritorious in the individuals and certainly favor the growth of capital. But no man of humanity could wish to see them constant and unremitted. They are most admirable as a temporary relief, but if they were constantly in action, effects of a similar kind would result from them as from the population in a country being pushed to the very extreme limits of its food. That's a quote from Malthus, by the way. Marx writes, all honor to Malthus that he lays stress on the lengthening of the hours of labor, a fact to which he directly draws attention elsewhere in his pamphlet, whereas Ricardo and others, flying in the face of the most notorious facts, make invariable in the length of the working day the groundwork of all their investigations. Nevertheless, so, I mean, you can see that that problem. Like, this is one of the big problems with like classical political economists, right? Is they don't take into consideration all the variables that Marx discusses here. So a lot of the time, this will result in a situation where they just directly equate the length of the working day with the rate of profit, right, generated. Yes. So they'll just say, "Oh, you cut it by 2 hours. That's going to cut a quarter," right? And again, like this is not you're not bringing it into relationship with the question of the value of labor power, with the question of the productivity of labor or its intensity, right? So all of those things have to be worked into that matrix, right? So he's saying here, he's giving a compliment to Malthus. He's saying, well, he makes an allusion to the length of the working day, right? And he's saying this makes him in a certain way like more sophisticated than some of the other. Nevertheless, the conservative interest Malthus served prevented him from seeing the unlimited prolongation of the working day, combined with an extraordinary development of machinery and the exploitation of the labor of women and children, inevitably made a great portion of the working class redundant, particularly after the cessation of wartime demand and the ending of the English monopoly of the world market. So again, here we see the importance of the world market, right?
Yeah.
You brought up the world market earlier. He's citing like England's, the ending of England's domination in this as being something that exerts economic pressure. But he's also saying that one consequence, so the unlimited prolongation of the working day. So this is what he focuses on in Victorian England, is that both absolute and relative surplus value are being maximized in different ways. But he's saying that this one problem with this is that, so you have increasing productivity like automation that's affecting people, but you also have an unwillingness to lower the hours so as to hire more people. Right? So this is a problem today, right? Because the working week hasn't went down, right? You know, in a way, we're in a similar situation today.
Yeah.
Right. Because the working week, you know, it's a slightly different thing, but the working week has been 40 hours since what? Like when was that? Like much of the I think most of the 20th century anyway. It was like, it depends what country, obviously, but
of course,
England or the States or something. I think we're looking at most of the 20th century. But so productivities went up, right? Now, okay, we haven't, if we're looking at the States or something, they haven't so much extended hours, right? But the consequence of that is that there's a diminishing amount of labor, right? and you're not creating new jobs for people by dividing that labor, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what that means, like a lot of people have said that we're in a situation in the United States where only 25% of the population is really economically productive, right? And that's the kind of, of course, I don't mean to equate one-to-one, like productivity with wealth, but obviously in the American circumstance, it is connected with the incapacity of large numbers of people to, find gainful employment, and be well off, right?
Mm-hmm.
So again, a little different here, right? Because we're not actually seeing, one could dispute this, but we're not generally seeing, I think, the working week increase, right? But I'm saying many of the effects are still manifest.
Depends.
Right?
I would say that the implementation of the gig economy and Uber drivers and all of that has led to a general increase in the working week. But it's circumstantial, I would say.
Yeah, that gets tricky though, because it seems to me that
I've seen the tendency, I think, in terms of, at least in the U.S., because it's lowered. What the gig economy has done is it's lowered the floor for entrance into the labor market. So you might have people that are otherwise unemployed, or maybe not, but they would have a more difficult time just entering the labor market. Now can sort of immediately get these gig economy jobs. So. And then there is a tendency to, especially because I work in South LA, and I see people who have these jobs a lot of times will, they will work 12 or 14 hours days.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it seems to me that one thing about where the gig economy is interesting is it seems to me that the gig economy is a little bit different, because the gig economy, correct me if I'm wrong, I think part of the idea is that the service sector has a higher rate of profit, right? Because it's more based on the payment for labor power, right? Higher ratio.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Yeah. Good point.
So one thing about this is that, in other words, they have to rely on the extension of the working day in order to actually and the direct performance of surplus labor, because productivity increases aren't as big of a factor, right? And that's why people have been moving. I mean, a lot of those fields are relatively unaffected by changes in productivity. I say relatively, right? Because there's still changes in all of them, but it's not the same as an industrial factory, for example. So you can argue that to specify that it's the gig economy doing that. It's
also Amazon. Amazon is doing that. All these other sort of companies are doing that in terms of creating the lowered floor, and then a lot of times you won't find people that are going into those jobs being against this tendency, because they are so glad to have, say, to be able to get a job through the Bezos machine or the gig economy machine. Sort of poses a difficulty, you could say, a propagandistic difficulty in terms of what if we raise the standard of labor, right?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is they're interconnected. I think it's really important you raise this, because if you have rising productivity, right, but you don't have an accompanying lowering of the work week, right, then you have a lot of people losing their jobs, right, because there's not a redistribution going on, right, of the actual labor time, and then you have a creation of a large surplus labor force, right, who are willing to do anything, right. Then you have, right, because as productivity increases, in many cases, you see a change in the organic composition of capital, where those sectors become less profitable. So then you have to say, well, how do we get, because you have to have redistribution between sectors. So how do we get profit? Well, we do it by turning to the service sector, right?
Yeah.
Which is more dictated by elongation of the working day, right? And again, we can loosely define what this. You have to really define, to be scientific about this. You'd have to really define what the service sector is, because you get different definitions. But the point is that it's the creation of that surplus labor force because of the increasing in productivity of industrial labor, for example, that makes people willing to perform those long days that actually generate a rate of profit high enough to balance out the whole schema, right? So you see this, and of course, then when coronavirus comes along, right? Wait 1 second. I'm going to talk about this in a minute, by the way. We're just trying to get through the chapter, and then I'm going to go back and answer. I'm going to look over the questions. We're going to try to answer a couple of them. But so when coronavirus comes along and fucks over the whole service sector, right? It's all of the people who are just kind of cleaving on, right? Just hanging on, right? trying to avoid falling into kind of the void of abject poverty, who are, working those long hours in those sectors that still generate a high rate of profit, right? Those people find themselves jobless, right? And in many cases, those in certain cases, those service industries will be absorbed into industries that are way more automated. Look at independent bookstores going out of business, right? And Amazon, right? So that's the thing. Like, you actually need this balance between service sector, like labor-intensive service sector, and the set 40-hour work week non-service sector, right?
Yeah.
And the more automated sectors are going to absorb the less automated sectors, right? Which are going to suffer also because they tend to be small businesses more and so forth, right? So you see the crisis of capitalism that's actually being generated by the coronavirus, which could be very, very serious. And I want to talk about that in a minute. But the last thing, I just want to finish this note here, and then Ernesto, maybe you can read the 8th.
Yeah.
It was, of course, far more convenient and much more in conformity with the interests of the ruling classes, whom Malthus idolized like a true priest, to explain this overpopulation by the eternal laws of nature, rather than the merely historical laws of the nature of capitalist production. Right. So again, overpopulation, we can see here that it's a phenomenon, right? The generation of the surplus labor force arising from, for example, an unwillingness to equally distribute, right, the gains associated with productivity, right? But this is good. I mean, I think in career opportunities, the Clash joke about, I don't want to serve tea at the BBC. I don't want to be a cop. I don't want to be shot at, in the hot sun or whatever, right? Like the job. So they're talking about the jobs that are available to someone, entering the workforce in the late 70s.
I was just thinking, in terms of imagine trying to become a cop right now.
Sorry?
Not just, but just oh man. I would say that it's interesting, the phenomenon of the entire police force as the holders of maintaining law is being questioned.
Yeah, big time.
Yeah. So now the conversation is no longer it's almost oh, but you need cops, so you need to police the cops. Now the conversation is defund the police, right? And the police are actually, they don't provide justice at all, which I think is it's simply not true.
What do you mean?
No, really. Well, I mean, the police force does have. You eliminate the police force. I don't think people are acknowledging the consequences of the total elimination of the police force.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. You can't do that unless you've eliminated alienation in a society.
Correct.
Which is, that's not a short-term project.
So what's happening instead is, which I think is true in terms of defunding the police presence in minority low-income communities,
and
which is
demilitarizing them too.
Yeah, the rhetoric is get rid of the police. They don't provide justice. Period. Full stop.
Correct.
Yeah.
I mean, also,
and I think. Oh, sorry. Do you want to go ahead, Ernesto?
I was going to say that a big problem that I think is related to the police criticism is that they are highly militarized.
Yeah. I mean, they're the police. Makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, if you demilitarize the police, I would take it as a decent appeasement tactic.
They're not going to give away their guns at this point. Holy shit!
Well,
it's not going to become England and America.
Well, I think part of the problem that you see is the fact that, as when you have this increasing disparity of wealth, it's part of an increasing discrepancy in the distribution of property, right? So we see this, right? Like these huge residential neighborhoods in Detroit where people used to have homes, in a community that was economically prosperous, and now a lot of those people have left, and probably moved into more prosperous economic centers where they're working service sectors and service sector jobs and are unable, for example, to own a home, right?
Correct.
So, and if you think of what the function of the police is, right, or are, I don't know if that's is okay. If you think of what the function of the police is, it's to protect private property, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that it seems to me that probably,
but it's not to protect private property. That's rhetoric. I mean, the function of the police is hypothetically to negate the crime of, say, it could be like an assault on somebody or murder. So
but in a liberal society, that's
operates hypothetically as in the Hegelian sense as the negation of social order through crime,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you're no longer thinking of crime as a negation of the social order, it makes sense to then no longer think of the police as the double negation of that initial negation.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, but if we're I guess what I would add though is like, so when I say protect property, we have to add a caveat, I think, to make it kind of coherent, which is that in a liberal society, you know, if you think of this notion of like the self-harm principle and so forth, right? Like I think that as someone without property, right? The appeal you could make to the police would be on the basis of harm that's done to your person,
Correct.
right? Your body and so forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
But all I'm saying is that the proprietarian function, I think, has to be acknowledged as well, right?
Sure.
So, though I do acknowledge there's a certain universality in a liberal, you know, pseudo-humanist society or whatever, in which everyone's bequeathed a certain in a republic, let's say. But what I mean by this is like, so Thomas Piketty points out that America and many societies in the mid 20th century, that's, you know, the most equitable distribution of wealth in recorded human history, right? So if you think of the knock-on effects in terms of property distribution, I mean, this is very palpable. I mean, Los Angeles, right? You had war veterans coming back and using their GI bonds, right, to buy homes directly that were like tailored, right, for the same price point as the GI bonds. So you could use that for a home or education. It's a very good example of how you transform, you know, a very, very disparate society into a society in which there's a large property-owning middle class, right? So I guess what I mean is, if we look at the you know, now we're slouching into levels of wealth inequality that are close, and I'm not kidding, like this is all in Piketty, close to like the Dickensian era, right? And I think in a way, like, you know, what I mean is, if you think of the historical exceptionality of that moment, like in the mid-century, which was related to the world wars and all kinds of things, communism in the Soviet Union and so forth, that may have represented like a short-term diffusion in the highly negative generalized perception of police, right? On account of the relatively equitable distribution of property. So you could say like, well, I own something in the society, right? So police are kind of protecting what I own, right? You know, but I'm saying we have to stress that's a very exceptional historical situation, right? So I really doubt people in like Victorian England. I doubt many people were under the illusion that the police were really benefiting them, you know, apart from whatever solace you can take in the theoretical sense in which your body or person entitles you to some kind of protection. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a general sense, the policing of crimes against your person, not property, be enforced, right? So there is a diremption there, which is whether or not they function significantly as the defenders of private property. There's the second piece, which is the defense against the crime against your person. It's a difference between getting your store broken and getting your neck broken.
It's very interesting though to look at where most crimes against people's bodies are happening, right? Because I think a lot of it, like I think a lot of violent crime, for example, you know, is connected with the drug trade, right? To give one instance, I think a lot of violent crime is connected with forms of alienation and stress that are induced by our system, right? You know, domestic violence and so forth, and sedimentary patriarchal structures. So I think the question here as to the essentiality of police, I mean, and you know, it's interesting to pose in light of your psychoanalytic background, Eliot. I think the real question here relates to how you situate alienation. And we have a stark difference here between Lacan and Marx, right? Because in the mature works of Marx, alienation is, as opposed to objectification, right, which is more universal. Alienation is conceived vis-a-vis material structures, right? But in Lacan, it's conceived, you know, as part of, you know, the essential construction of the human psyche in a way, right?
Yeah, but
the negative.
Yeah. And then there's, I think Hegel takes a different view of it entirely, because his view is always the quote unquote director's view. I think, in terms of it's the extension of Kant's metropolitan view, even more so, because it's not like the petit bourgeois view. It's the, you know, it's the grand bourgeois or monarch view, you could even say, of the necessity of these apparatuses. and how they
Well, I don't know.
operate.
I don't know. Like if you're talking about philosophy of right, though, I mean, Zizek makes a good point about philosophy of right.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, well, he makes a good point about philosophy of right, which is that in a way, like people often take this view, like philosophy of right is like, you know, Hegel's model for like a sort of, you know, best society or something. And I think this is a little bit simplistic because it seems to me that
I don't think it's necessarily the model of the best society. It's not. I'll let you finish.
Okay, well, you can clarify. I mean, obviously, it's not purely utopian, right? Because you know Hegel's the thinker of the is rather than the ought. But we have to ask ourselves what that is would mean, right? It seems to me that in the philosophy of right, he's trying to provide a model for how, you know, societies are poised to develop in adherence to the principle of reason, specifically after the you know, dramatic destruction of a lot of the feudal forces in Europe in the wake of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic invasions, right? So this had already happened in Germany, right, where they're beginning to, you know, make gestures towards unification and adopt republican constitutional structures, right? But I guess what I mean is like I think that philosophy of right has to be read in the context of that historical trajectory, you know, and I'm not. I think sometimes there's a tendency, and I'm not saying you do this, but I think sometimes people will, you know, use philosophy of right as a rationalization for how like a liberal republic might function today, right?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily even a liberal republic. I think it's more relevant than ever in terms of now that law itself is being questioned. The difference between morality, law of the heart, or the individual impulse, and right is now the question in a way that never has been before.
Yes.
Morality versus right. The idea of you feel like all cops are bad because the police tendency to murder minorities in cold blood, essentially. Does that invalidate the entire system of right in favor of the system of moral intuition? And we're going into a distinctly anti-rational direction right now. In terms of
he
that,
speaks to the need. He speaks to the need for the two to be reconciled in philosophy of right.
Yeah, sure.
Like that. But okay, so here's the thing. Like, I agree with you that those would be like Hegel says. You know, liberalism is the problem of our time. You know, that we'll have to invest ourselves in trying to resolve, right? And I think, you know, I agree with you that the conundrums of the philosophy of right hold true. I think for any societies adherent to a theoretical principle of reason, you know, emerging in the wake of the French Revolution, right? But I just meant that I also think it's important to situate that with respect to the historical trajectory that he's delineating, right? So what I mean is like it's not that problem. This is your point. This is where I'm agreeing with you. You know, it's not. The point is there's no resolution in the philosophy of right. Right. The resolution is also sort of also a potential or theoretical apparatus, right? It's a potential for a certain resolution. It's a problem that's bestowed to these societies based on their composition, and those are still the problems we face, right, in societies that are similarly structured like the United States today, right?
Am I back?
Welcome back.
Yeah, my entire thing just.
Does that make sense though, Eliot? What I was saying about that? What do you think?
I missed a good portion because my entire thing died.
I was just saying that the conundrums, like I agree with you, but its relevance. I was just saying that the conundrums of the philosophy of right, you know, there's no like, it's not that there's a best system posited in it, as I think you observed. It's that these are conundrums that are particular to the emergence of certain political structures, right, in a certain context that has continued till today.
Yeah.
Right. So we're still working out those problems.
Yeah, and right in terms of rights necessity to sort of resolve these sort of contradictory forces.
Yes.
And to legislate over morality. Yeah. Could we just go to the last footnote? I just want to finish 7, and then maybe Ernesto, you can read 8. The last footnote.
Are you done? Go ahead.
Yeah. So I was just going to say, of course, about Malthus that he didn't recognize the creation of surplus populations by the capitalist system, right? Or the way that this was occurring due to the pursuit of absolute and relative surplus value in the context of 19th century England. But he attributed it to like an eternal tendency whereby surplus populations would be generated, right? Because the how does he say? There's a linear increase in the rise of food, but an exponential increase in the increasing of the population, right? So from this, he deduced that it was necessary basically to starve out large segments of the population in order to curb this tendency. That providing forms of social welfare would only enable the poor to have lots of kids and exacerbate the problem. But again, so this is, it's fucked up, right? He was a minister, by the way. He was a Protestant minister.
That's I don't know if that's worse or better.
Yeah, this is like prosperity theology, right?
Makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, but and by the way, I want to say about Kirsty. Kirsty, you said something about, yeah, some of my friends move into their jobs and instead of working less, they just buy more expensive shit and work all the time still. In Max Weber, The Protestant Spirit and the Origin of Capitalism, he contraposes or compares Catholic and Protestant societies, and he observes that in Protestant countries, when people are, like when this process occurs, whereby, for example, the working day is shortened, right? The tendency of people of Protestant backgrounds and in Protestant countries is to perform more surplus labor, right? Because like insofar as that coincides with an increase in the value of labor power, right, is to perform more surplus labor, right, in order to get more shit. Whereas the tendency of Catholics is just to take the cut, like, okay, I don't have to work as much, right? So he locates that in. I was trying to translate that to Marxian terminology. I don't know if it was totally successful, but he basically he locates the structural basis of capitalism in the Protestant tendency to live austerely so as to save yourself for the afterlife, right? And there's a similar bent that can be seen, in capitalism, of course, the idea that you accumulate capital, but that also can be manifest in the psychology of workers from Protestant countries, right? Which gets us back to Hegel's point, right? When he says that the French Revolution failed because France wasn't Protestant, right? Because his point was that they hadn't internalized the structure of the society to an adequate degree.
Which isn't entirely a good read in terms of, although it's an essential quality of Protestantism, right? Not.
Yeah, it's a bit German chauvinistic, but I still think, as Hegel usually is, I think he's right about the disidentification of, because when you have this absolute Catholic monarchy, I think people just get this thing, and even today you see it in France, they make, they have laws and just they're laws, and it's just known that nobody follows them, right? It's a little bit different in Germany in terms of how this functions, right? So I think there's a distancing or or illegitimacy that arises in those kind of structures. So Hegel will argue, well, it's for this reason that, in a certain way, that the French Revolution had to, it had a great impact and influence, but it had to terminate in the creation of a sort of centralized Republican state. So, of course, in one way, the Napoleonic state carried on the legacy of Republican constitutionalism, but it wasn't democratic. Right. And for him, it was natural that if you have a place that's going from absolutist monarchy, right, that, there hasn't been enough time, right, for the notion of individuality, right, or for the individual's relationship to society to be adequately cultivated, right. You still have this just discrepancy in there, right. So I think that's a very, very interesting interpretation. But Ernesto, do you want to go for the 8th footnote? That's the last thing we got to do.
Yeah, sure thing. 8. A principal cause of the increase of capital during the war proceeded from the greater exertions and perhaps the greater privations of the laboring classes, the most numerous in every society. More women and children were compelled by necessitous circumstances to enter upon laborious occupations, and former workmen from the same cause obliged to devote a greater portion of their time to increased production.
During the war, more women and children were compelled in necessitous circumstances to enter upon laborious occupations. Former workmen.
Well, some of that. Well, what comes to mind for me is when there is an equaling of labor intensity. You could say in a hypothetical situation where there is no more third world, just hypothetically, right? Sorry, Conrad, I don't know. Aside. But if the third world is sort of like solved or whatever, that would mean these sorts of. That's idealistic, actually. I'm going to negate the whole thing. I'm going to forget the whole thing, because my idea is like the intensity of labor will then increase everywhere, right? And I think that's where, well, not everywhere. Maybe it would decrease in quote unquote third world, but it would definitely increase where, say, the U.S. is at. But that might not be true, because certain places might have certain types of labor and others might not. Anyway, Conrad, what are you going to say?
No, I think that makes sense. I think that makes sense what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think it makes sense what you're saying, because I think it like if you didn't have systemic underdevelopment, right, then you would have an increasing in the intensity of labor power, right, the intensity of its application. So, you know, and like you see the way that, like, if we approach it from the axis of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, we see the way that you know, because I was talking about the service sector. I mean, it's also the case that, again, like, and I've raised this time and time again, but that you're getting more proportional variable capital normally in less developed countries, right? So it serves a similar function to the service sector in that way, in terms of buoying the rate of profit. This actually explains why, in a way, and this is a very subtle thing that, like, I try to articulate to people, but sometimes people are like, well, how does China becoming, like, capitalist, like, how can that be part of, like, a Marxist world revolution? And, like, one thing is, like, it's like they're actually eliminating, like, you know, by raising all those people out of poverty and by developing a country to that degree, they're actually eliminating you know, those sort of more labor intensive and less developed regions, right, that are necessary to the reproduction of capitalism in the first world, right?
Right.
You know, so in other words, like, they're changing the entire, they're altering the entire global distribution of wealth, right, and challenging the conditions that capitalism requires to reproduce itself, even while paradoxically enabling it in the short term, right? And it makes sense on that basis that America would go from, like, being like, yeah, you know, China, whatever, like, but, you know, it would make sense in a way that America would go from being, you know, sort of calculatedly praiseful, right, of, you know, the kind of things that are going on to China, to becoming hostile to it, right, as it becomes a greater threat.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Our government actually announced about a week or two ago that we have a new trade deal with China. We're going to help us with stimulus for our own economic growth.
Yeah, I did see that.
Yeah.
I'll find a more thorough
like
source.
American chauvinism is going to. I feel like Trump. My thought is, like, Trump is dialectically making America great, because he's accelerating all these contradictions and putting in the front of everyone's face American chauvinism. Yeah, and then so.
It's great.
It is. No, it is true though. It's like, in a way, it's like, because, like, I don't know, like, this guy just defunded the WHO because he's like, it's totally controlled by China, right? And it's like, you know, like, how do you, like, where does that logic take you, right? It's like, you know, and this is the way he talks, right? Like, you know, America, we're going to stop investing everywhere, stop investing in Europe. It's totally controlled by China, right? Like, he seems to have a really weird understanding of how this kind of investment works. Like, it's like a totally one-way street. The Japanese are killing us. Okay, true. The Japanese have, like, a preferential trade relationship with the United States, right, in terms of creating trade surpluses, and you know, in certain ways, free trade is not reciprocated fully, right? But it's like, why would America do that, right? So they could create, like, a giant capitalist power, right, you know, to prevent, you know, to check the development of communist China, right, which is a very, very, you know, in Russia as well at the time. So he doesn't really seem to grasp the nuances of how this functions. So often, you know, you just got to take the ball and go home. Right, and the result is, like, a net diminution of American global power, because he's not intelligent enough to understand how these things, you know.
Yeah, well, he does the same thing with Mexico.
Trump is a business capitalist, and he's not a world economic capitalist. And when you're a business capitalist, you can stick the opportunity cost to the other fairly easily. But when you're running a nation, you simply can't, to a certain extent. You can try, but you'll find the is, like you said, the Hegel's philosophy is, you'll find the is actually has a deep logic to it that he doesn't have access to, vis-a-vis being a dumbass. You could say.
Well, it is true, and I would go so far as to speculate that his approach to race would be incomprehensible if you don't understand, like, the peculiar mentality of, like, New York area landlords,
So?
You know, well, I mean, you got to remember that his father was like, his father
Fred,
was,
right?
yeah, his father was sued, I think, by the city of New York for violating, you know, basically civil rights laws in terms of, you know, practicing racially exclusionary policies in terms of who he was taking into his buildings, right? You know, and that, you know, that was actually had some importance, right? Because people associated more diverse neighborhoods with poverty, right? So he's trying to maintain the value, right, of the actual apartments by doing that. But what I meant is like, you know, the, you know, it's kind of like when Trump when he oscillates between this, like, I love black people, I think they're the best, right? You know, and then when he goes like, there's too much political correctness. Okay, well, we could agree with that here at Zero for different reasons, but okay, there's too much political correctness and this kind of thing. You know, I think it has to do quite specifically the way that with the way that he conceptualizes, you know, certain racialized populations as creating obstacles to the valorization of capital, right? So it's not like, again, it's kind of an interesting form of racism because it's not, let's say, a purely patriarchal racism. It speaks to the way in which racism has actually been assimilated and normalized within the context of American capitalist relations. And on this note, I love Stephen Shaviro. I don't know if you guys read Stephen Shaviro. Great thinker. He
anti-accelerationist.
Is he? Okay, yeah. Well, he does Whitehead and different things associated a little bit with speculative realism, but he said if they can refer to China as what does it say? What as socialism with Chinese characteristics? He said it's hyper-capitalism is socialism with Chinese characteristics. Then I think we could call America capitalism with Confederate characteristics, which we're seeing now. I just want to rewind really quick to respond to one of Kirsty's comments that because Kirsty made. By the way, Kirsty, thank you so much for making these wonderful images.
Yeah, I love them. The collage.
Yeah, well, you were you got a little more love too, right? Because what is it? Like what is it? Ernesto awakes.
Our pictures didn't look very good, and then they swung up behind Ernesto.
Well, Ernesto is a pretty good looking guy, but I liked what is it? It was like Ernesto after the moment. I read the exact quote, like after the moment where the world is turned red. Ernesto wakes up and he sees his comrades aren't there, or something like that. I don't know, but I did like it. I really appreciate the art. I love the hammer and sickle.
That's so true. It could happen, Ernesto. That shit could happen. Well, actually, no. That's idealism once again. Idealism. No, that will not happen.
Well, it's because Ernesto's the new man. Ernesto's the new man. We have to like, you know, reciprocally liquidate each other in purges, you know, to enable Ernesto, the new man, to repopulate the earth, right? I want to go down to the question about geometry. We see here, Christy, we have several. I want to know what Conrad meant by geometric, and what I'm talking right now is its movement, geometrics, and infinite division. I would like this clarified. So I think in a way you were putting together two things that actually happen in the text, right? So one is the reference to geometry. So I was actually quoting Marx. So it's not my overcodified lexicon. It's the lexicon of Marx. But he says that he says here what about the wear and tear on actual labor power imposed by the lengthening of hours. But beyond this point, deterioration increases in geometrical progression, and all the requirements for the normal reproduction and functioning of labor power cease to be fulfilled. The price of labor power and the degree of its explication cease to be commensurable qualities. The price of labor power and the degree of its exploitation cease to be commensurable qualities, right? So what he's saying here is that he's just saying that like if you increase the working day, that there's a geometric decline in the productivity of labor power associated with the physical demands that imposes on the worker, right? And now, you know, she connected that, I think, with something else going on in the text, which is like, because, you know, geometry, right? Yeah, in a certain sense, geometry, in the sense that, you know, or just math would work too. But in the sense that you have these ratios that are constantly shifting in relation to each other, right? So this whole chapter deals extensively with this. Like this chapter is not so clear, but it's very, very important because it's in this chapter that you can pull out the means to start to understand how you could have something like an enlarged middle class, in the context of capitalist prosperity, right? Because Marx actually works in two modes in Capital. Like on one hand, he will talk about the overwhelming tendency of the capitalist mode of production in his time, right? And he spells out what that is. It's absolute and relative surplus value being maximized at the same time, right? But he also here he complicates that picture considerably, right? So again, there's the immiseration thesis as and by the way, you can defend the immiseration thesis even at a transhistorical level, because Thomas Piketty shows that capital increases at a faster rate than the general economy, right? Mm-hmm. But that's still a tendency, right? It doesn't mean that that's going to happen in every particular situation.
Yeah.
Right. So even if you want to defend an overarching capitalist immiseration thesis, then I don't know, that would require you to be, embrace a certain teleology, which is already maybe dubious. You still have to qualify a lot the different ratios and expressions that are going to emerge. Right. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that's my Thomas Piketty. Yeah. Well, I think he is French. I assume that's Italian, right? Piketty. So I assume he's Italian French by origin. Should we take an extra minute to talk about the riots and stuff? Because we got through this chapter, but we haven't talked at all about that stuff.
I think we did a little bit, but sure.
We talked more about Mexico, but I thought maybe we could, if you want, do you want to talk?
Yeah, in LA, I think something in terms of one of the dangers of being quote unquote anti-political correctness is I think there's a qualitative shift in quote unquote political correctness where now you're like, well, it's not equal if only one sect has access and their identity becomes sublated as the ultimate demand that others must follow. However, this has happened, and it's not happened on a small level either. It's happened on a sort of national level where there is sort of the demands of, you could say, black nationalism contra U.S. right has come to a legitimacy which widespread, which it never seen before in terms of Malcolm X separation from right. Not fully, but I think there's this sense. So in terms of what we call identity politics, might contain a little too much of what is the authentic dissent, and then what is the general dissent of the U.S. pushing their, controlling the third world through capital exploitation. Although I'm not necessarily sure it will be read that way by Americans protesting fully. But there's a lot of talk about indigenous land and things like that, and it is interesting. The forces of history are certainly at work, and like I said, I simply have no idea what's going to happen as a result.
And they're saying that Trump's declaring that Antifa are terrorists, and the terrorists are behind the riots. So are people gonna get arrested on domestic terrorist charges now?
Well, they already have been. But I guess if it's a terrorist organization, mere membership. Of course, it's a bit vague.
Well,
because, what is Antifa even, right?
Well, what's interesting is I have a flag somewhere here. I have this flag which I've brought to protest before, and I thought of bringing this, and I said I don't want to associate anarchism with BLM or whatever they're trying to do. So then I was like, what I should do that would legitimize it is bring the American flag. That didn't work out so well either. That actually got taken and burnt. and a guy actually said he's like there's another black guy who was like he was I was marching with a lot of people and he's like, man, I'm really sorry. I'm like, hey man, I got outvoted. When you get outvoted, you get outvoted, and next time maybe I'll find a what is it, white people for Black Lives flag or something. Or find one that's less of a psyop and more directly aligned, right, or something like that. Because my thought was I'd bring the American flag and they wouldn't be able to be tear gassed, but of course that's not the goal. You have to listen to the goal of the organization.
Correct.
Yeah. I personally don't think you should ever.
Yeah.
I personally don't think you should ever deface the flag of a republic that has any degree of legitimacy, because I think that and this is kind of Hagel's point in the
a lot of people would
right?
disagree with you.
Yeah, I mean, but I think that, and I'm not saying it should be illegal or whatever, but I'm just talking like the level of, because I think this is Hagel's point in the philosophy of right, that, if you think of like what a liberal republic is, right? And I'm not saying that that's the be all end all of what organization could represent, political organization could represent, but I think that, again, there's an adherence to a principle of rational social order, at least theoretically, that carries within it the means of its own emancipation, right? So if you look at the way that people like variously people like Martin Luther King appealed to the contents of the U.S. Constitution to make a case for civil rights, right?
That's not the case anymore. I think it really has to be understood that is no longer the case for a lot of these forces in terms of.
But is it not? Because they're still motivated by. I would argue they're still motivated by, let's say, like a liberal principle.
Defund the police, prosecute the police, which involves mechanism of right. It's there. It's somewhere in there. Somewhere in there.
What I mean is that Kirsty, I like this. Is that the same burrito?
It is the same burrito. I caught it, and then I remembered my flag getting ripped out of my fucking hand. And me being like a shitlord, and then I had to eat some more burrito.
We actually all live in the same flat in Akron, Ohio. We've just kind of like structured it so that it looks like we're in different places. We try to create an appearance of no, but what I mean is I don't mean that as like apologia for anything. Look, I don't want to like glorify. My point in saying that wasn't to glorify King and to shit on the riots. My point was merely to say that I think that insofar as these kind of appeals are made based on the notion of generalized equality, right? I think that they already resemble, a lot of the, potentialities that are already latent, right? In the notion of republic, right?
But here's the thing, and Andrew's saying, I think one really has to be a Hegelian here. You cannot like a psyop or like I tried to be. Don't burn the flag, twist its image to tournament man. The problem is this large movement sees the American flag is equal to the whites, like the Confederate flag or something, right? So you have an authentic dissenting movement, which is a large-scale movement that immediately associates the American flag like it's like the Ku Klux Klan flag. So you just have to essentially say that sort of idea or that combination is sort of present. A lot of people don't think that in the movement, but a lot of people do.
Well, but this is interesting though, because if we surveyed the black population in general, in many respects they score higher on indices of patriotism, right?
Yeah.
And I think for that to happen, you would have to understand the capacity for a dissociation between say the American Republic and what any black person can acknowledge is its very racist history and present, right? So all I mean is that to me, if you say, well, the American flag is the same thing as the Confederate flag, you're actually conflating two things. And this already speaks to a problem that's inherent in identity politics, right? Or can be.
But that's what I'm saying, Conrad. The point is you're right.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you.
There is an actual force in the world in which they are the same. And that's sort of has to be taken from there to a certain extent, right?
Well, and what you have to separate out is just to say that there are patriarchal aspects, right, that again have integrated themselves into the structure of capitalism, and like Barron and Sweezy dwell heavily on this, like how the migration of blacks to urban areas created a kind of racial subcase that could be then exploited more cheaply, and that American capitalism quickly became dependent on, right? So that it was actually structurally reproduced, right? But the point is, this is still different than like a Confederate feudal mode of production, right? And if you think of the analogy that Hegel draws between logic, right? The moment in which logic is ushered into the world, and the French Revolution, right? That analogy is drawn because he knows, right, that logic isn't perfect, right? But the point is that logic gives itself the means to correct itself or to develop, right?
Yeah.
In a way that strict determinations do not. I mean, the Confederacy actually wanted to write racial inequality into their constitution for this exact reason, right? Because they knew that, well, they knew that rather than using, let's say the ambiguous language of personhood, and then as that refers to whites, what they were trying to do is to make a clear, hard delineation between those groups, right? So this is why I said, like, America is a republic that is capitalist and is dependent on certain patriarchal aspects, but it also is, to its credit, democratic insofar as democracy exists anywhere. And it is a state that's adherent to certain theoretical universal ideals that can be juxtaposed and pitted against the character of the immediate, country itself.
Yeah, right? The immediate spirit, you might say.
Yeah.
Vulgarize the use of space.
Yeah, so I like this. Don't burn the flag. Twist its image to turn them all, man. I mean, I agree. This is my point about republic, right? I'm saying like Marxism. It's very interesting that Marxist countries are also republics. They're like people's republics, right? And I think that's a kind of détournement, right, of the notion of republic as well, that's occurring there, right?
Like that.
In which the meaning of republic, right? We can talk about Florence and Machiavelli and kind of how this idea of republic developed. Rome, of course, being obvious, but in its modern sense, I think it's coming through Florence, and you have France and so on. What I mean is that if you contrast, what does it mean to be a Republican versus to be a liberal, right? And traditionally, that distinction was made. Whereas liberalism makes an appeal to negative freedom, right? Or the immediacy of one's freedom, right? Your right to do this, right? Republicanism is based on an emphasis of the need for radical reformulation, so as a society can actually create the conditions whereby real freedom is possible, right? So a good example of this exists in the tension that was inherent to slave owning in the South, right? There were lots of people who were like liberals who believed that defended slave owning because they're like, well, it's your property, it's your right, right? And for Lincoln to be in the party which was founded by John Fremont to say I'm a Republican, right? What that meant in that time, right, was I believe that we actually have to go against the grain of what we conceptualize as individual freedom in order to create the real conditions of freedom for the masses. So you can see how that can be like republicanism kind of becomes socialism in a way, right? You can see how that can be applied with this sort of détournement toward people's republic, right? That ultimately the creation of a real republic, right, actually requires the overturning of the capitalist mode of production, right?
Our territory. Accelerate the flag.
Is this someone commenting on me? I mean, I thought that what I said made sense.
No. People, I think all of us are very like nice. I think this is like the nice con. I think the nice con tendency. And I think all of us have this similar impulse. It's like, are you doing so? It's like, no, this is a safe space, Conrad. This is a safe space.
This is a safe space for privileged cultural class Marxists over here. Except Ernesto, we've allowed him to real industrial labor. We've allowed him to come in here. But I want to say, I just want to ask you guys though, because we've been exploring, and I just want to say quickly that I don't, again, about the riots, I also think that in a certain way, and not to valorize or criticize them, I think they're part of this process of working out of the meaning of republic that I'm describing. Even if some of those people think that that's not what they're doing and this is just the Confederacy, right? I think they're also part of that process. But I just want to say, what do you guys think of the riots then? What do you think? Because there's obviously a split in the left in terms of the response to it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my initial thought, I said I did it in a longer video, was the kind of joke term acid Fukuyamaism, in terms of Fukuyama's argument that liberal democracy provides the equal recognition that universal principles like you were outlining, that other forms of government cannot provide. And I think you're seeing the failure of that, right? to a certain extent, in terms of racial classes not recognizing themselves in the liberal democratic principles. So I do think we're seeing an evolution of recognition, and I don't quite know what it looks like yet. I don't think anybody does, about what this mass insurrection or mass rioting, you could say, because insurrection is, you could say it's insurrection, sure, anti-capitalist insurrection, but you know, we'll see. We will see. We'll see how it. I don't think it will be satiated because, like I said, I think the demands of negating the police, or as the holders of the determiners of, or the negators of crime, the initial negators in the justice system, and abolishing prisons, are demands that are so outside of the logical principles of right that this group demand, or the sort of black nationalist demand, will never be met. It simply can't be met. And you're going to see this sort of like splinter in liberal democracy. And I don't know what that splinter is going to do to the liberal democracy. Right. So we will see.
I think the problem with Fukuyama, like, to be clear, I don't agree with Fukuyama about that. I think the problem with Fukuyama is that he over-identifies, and it's connected to Kojiev in some ways, but that he over-identifies.
He loves Kojiev, by the way.
Yeah. So you can't. He even says, like, it's a Kojievian take on Hegel, right? Kojiev was a Stalinist spy who later became an important European community functionary. But I think the problem is that he falsely associates, like, if I'm going to Hegel, just skipping the Kojiev, that he falsely associates, this kind of moment in which a social model is developed that allows for its own working out with, the necessary continuity of a liberal capitalism that's structurally similar in many ways with, like, what existed in certain countries in the 90s, right? So I actually agree with this thesis about the working out, but I said that I situated it more with respect to the concept of republic for a reason, right? Because I don't want to tether it to liberal capitalism, right? And that's what I was talking about, People's Republic, right? Yeah. The necessary overturn, like the way you can think it's necessary for the capitalist mode of production itself to be overturned, in order for the notion of republic.
What I think is going to happen, at some point, victory will be declared to some extent.
By
that
who?
Will satiate a lot of people, and I think it like those, but I don't even know what it would look like, because the idea that you will take the police force, you'll take, like, somehow you'll negate the force of the police's ability to enact force on citizens to enforce law. When that's sort of invalidated entirely, it's a real mess.
Well, this is just abstract negation as well, right? Like, I mean, the most radical demands of the French Revolution weren't achievable, but in demanding them, they were able to change society a great deal. So I think I don't disagree with you, but I think also we should be conscious of the nuance in terms of how that functions, right? In which you demand things which are seeming
nuance. Yeah, you're right, though. You are right. Won't somebody think of the nuance?
I mean, it's symbolic over here. I think to me, I actually was going to say one thing I think that ends up being a problem with Fukuyama is that he really sort of takes to heart, like, Marx's point about all that's solid melts in air, capitalism overturns all feudal patriarchal idyllic divisions, right? But if we actually contrast that with other things Marx writes, right, you can see that he acknowledges the two sides, right? So he talks about the way that previous social hierarchies, persist but become recodified and secularized with respect to capitalism, right? So you often see this weird binary in Marxist theory. Like, Zizek tends to stress the egalitarian function of capitalism to make his critique of political correctness and so forth, right? Silvia Federici, by contrast, will really stress, the way that capitalism is dependent upon, women's reproductive labor, and especially women in the third world, and how it strengthens a lot of patriarchal divisions. I think one has to conclude that both these things are true, and that it depends everywhere. It depends where you are within the capitalist hierarchy, right?
Would you say, Conrad, that that if that a Marxist if a Marxist principle is distinctly outside of the posit of something that could be achieved through right, that it is literally cultural Marxism?
If a Marxist principle cannot
That's
be,
my troll
yeah.
take.
Yeah, I would. Well, okay. Well, what is cultural Marxism come from? I mean, I guess people often cite Adorno and stuff, but a lot of what Western Marxism views the incapacity of the West to generate revolution as relating to questions of cultural change.
Yeah.
You know, and you see this clearly taken up in Gramsci in terms of cultural hegemony. So yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that would be cultural Marxism. Yes, Eliot is always right. This is true.
That's because I'm willing to take or in fact compulsively take what is it you could call it, the troll take, the Murphy-esque take. That's the Murphy-esque position at times.
I haven't read this, by the way. I'll look into it. About the riots. So, but just about the riots, like, what do you like? Just to try to get like really to the gritty stuff. I know we don't like answering questions straightforwardly or anything because we, you know, all have a healthy interest in theory.
No, I didn't see this article.
I didn't see it. But what do you guys think? What do you guys think then of the riots as a positive social force, negative social force? What do you think?
As the guy who I explained Hegel to while he was on ecstasy said, it is what it is. But in a literal sense, it is.
Mm-hmm.
And then the thing that it is a social force.
Oh, you're using dialectical, language analysis, right?
To posit the is what it is, as the man on MDMA says.
It can't because
what is it in the is that we are talking about, and the is that I'm talking about within the is its capacity as a force actual in the world.
Mm-hmm.
That we can't moralize about necessarily. Well, we can, but we will have to sort of see as it goes forward.
Yeah, well, and I think, you know, it's interesting, like what you're doing here with dialectical language analysis, right? So to say it is what it is means there has to be a contradiction between the two terms, right? Because else you wouldn't say it. You wouldn't say it. So there's something there. You know, I think, you know, you can already see a kind of disjunction between the is and the ought that's occurring there, right? In the sense that it's like it is what it is, whereas that resists definition, right? So there's an indeterminate potentiality that's exactly apparent in the phrase "it is what it is."
Yeah. The nominal quality of what it is.
Yeah.
Perhaps we should mind it dialectically with the second is.
Ernesto, what do you think about the riots? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I guess I'm concerned because, as everybody expected, the police responded. I just can't put it inside. You know, I can't wrap my head around it. But why did the police respond with police violence to riots about police violence, right? But yeah, I just feel like the United States is not handling it well at all. I'm not sure what they're gonna do now. I fear that they might involve the army. I understand that the states are calling the National Guard, but what is the National Guard gonna do? Sorry?
National Guard has been called to LA.
Yeah. But what do they expect to happen? People, like you said, Eliot, it's a force. People won't stop.
Yeah. It's not necessarily a causal logic.
Yeah, and what concerns me the most is that every day the situation escalates.
Yeah.
I think to the question, you know, so things now are extremely unstable because of coronavirus, right?
Yeah.
And we haven't seen what's going to happen because
it's the other thing I was thinking about.
Yeah, and so I think responding with violence.
Everybody's been isolated for months, and then suddenly, by the way, social distancing wasn't happening.
No kidding.
Wasn't happening. Shoulder to shoulder, and thousands.
How responsible.
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere near. I think I'm good already from being in Hong Kong in December, but just in case, I'm staying away from some things like that. But
What would
in terms of the coronavirus, like people were isolated and then they weren't, and then they fucking wreaked havoc. Right?
Mhm.
I think Andrew Wiggin, I think you nailed what Althusser would say about that. And this is what I was getting at too when I talked about the more inequitous distribution of property. You know, I don't want to highlight just the riots. I want to highlight what Eliot was pointing out, is that there seems to be greater sympathy for these sentiments than ever before.
Yeah.
Right. And I think if we ask ourselves, why does that sympathy exist? I think it exists, because, there's an incompatibility, between the ideological apparatuses and people's material conditions, because so many of our ideological apparatuses are predicated on the notion that there's a real, not going to say equal, right, but there's let's say a relative equality of access to property ownership, right?
Yeah.
So I think that people become much more sympathetic, right? And it's always the most vulnerable or most adversely affected by recessions, of which COVID has caused as well.
Yeah.
And I think people are especially sensitive and supportive of an anti-authoritarian message at this time, more so than you would expect.
Mhm.
So again, but I think this is speaks to a more general, more general tension between American ideological apparatuses and the actual composition of society in the post-Reagan era.
All right, so maybe we should wrap it up. We're at like 2:30.
Oh wait, I wanna say one more thing about. I just want to give just my evaluation. I just want to say quickly. I certainly understand why people are mad. Sometimes there's a weird binary in terms of how these things are assessed, where people are like, you're either pro or anti-violence, right? And it's like, I'm not anti-violence, But I guess what I think is problematic is the total lack of organization. It's not just police stations we're seeing torched, also social housing, community infrastructure. Maybe this will all work.
Organized, but the organizers aren't. They're not thinking in a reform sense. They're thinking in an insurrectionary sense.
Well, I mean, I support insurrection, right? I think I support insurrection, but insurrection can have a tangible political goal other than lighting infrastructure on fire, right? So I'm sure there's some of those people who are like that, but I also see there's a very, very anarchic element, which is quite prevalent. Maybe it will work out, and that will be a moment, that enables positive change in the system.
Yeah.
Maybe it won't, but I think it's far less assured than it would be, right? Were there more and better organization involved. And it's also, one thing about it, I said it's also, the people, a lot of people like, so you were criticizing Ben, but I think Ben, I don't agree with it totally, but I think he does have a point as well, that a lot of the people who are going to be face the consequences of this are going to be the most vulnerable members of society as well, in terms of being fed into the carceral system and so forth. Right. In a way that would be less disproportionate if there was a more generalized social cause.
Yeah.
Right? Not to mention the Murphyist take, the coronavirus take.
Oh yeah, the X over Y.
How many X is X greater than Y? How many more people will be killed by the coronavirus? And that's the troll take, because it's true, but it's so irrelevant to the general spirit that it becomes untrue to a certain extent.
Irrelevant, really.
Well, we'll see what happens now. Things are so crazy. Like, we don't even know, right? I mean, we haven't begun to, I think, register the significance of what COVID represents. If fiscal policy is not used to address the fundamental needs of the population, if this is used as a pretext for kind of capitalist shock therapy, the insurrection could be massive. I mean, there was already the Gilets jaunes in France prior to this, right? Let's just add coronavirus and its economic and public health impact to the mix and see what's going on. I mean, I don't think that revolutionary action is out of the question. I think that it depends how the government responds, but I think that COVID could enable it. Now, when I say revolutionary, I don't necessarily mean it's going to be the right people doing a revolution. I would be very concerned that the far right are in the best position to exploit angers that are likely to emerge about the absence of a sufficient government response. I think the safest bid right now is for the left to exert pressure on the government to you use fiscal policy, because monetary policy is already exhausted, but basically negative interest rates now, to use fiscal policy to meet the needs of the working people and the citizenry, to prevent a far-right exploitation of public anger. Because I don't think the left is organized enough now to actually stage an insurrectionary movement that could lead to taking power.
Yeah, well, the problem with the far right in America, you could say, for their own causes, what they've recently fought for is to spread the coronavirus as freely as they want, and then also their figurehead is Trump, who's very just pops off at the mouth with no consequentialism. So that's good news for people who don't.
I mean, there's many faces to the right wing, also, right?
There's what?
Many faces to the right wing in the United States, also.
Are there though?
I would say so. I don't. Okay, I'm assuming.
Well,
Yeah.
there's a basic bifurcation in the Republican Party between sort of more radical alt-right elements and more traditional neoconservative, I don't want to even say center right, but right elements. And I think that there was a coalition between those elements, right, for Trump to win and for all this to happen.
Of course. Yeah, I wonder what that branch of the right wing is going to do.
We shall see.
Yeah.
Eliot, are the Democratic primaries on hold now? I don't know. Not sure. We will see.
Will the elections be on hold? We'll see.
Probably not.
Well, we did get that.
Right.
We have been delivered these remarkable, like one positive or negative, depending on your perspective, outcome of the terrible Democratic primaries, in which centrist candidates united to an unprecedented degree to prevent the specter of a Sanders victory, is that we now get this weekly regular comic relief from Biden every single time he has to do a live interview. I don't know if you heard most recently. Yeah, if you have to, if you're not sure if you're to choose Trump or me, then you ain't black, right? That was one of our last blasts. If he hasn't been in the news for saying,
that's really not good. That's very bad.
Yeah.
It's clarifying. It's clarifying.
I honestly, at this point, despite it undermining Biden and the legitimacy of the Democratic center, I honestly at this point wish he didn't say that.
It is clarifying, isn't it? It's clarifying.
Yeah.
It is. He also, I'm not sure if he shot himself or not on an interview, but I don't know if you guys saw that.
Oh, the fart thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know what to think of the U.S. now.
Yeah. Well,
it's a fucking mess, bro. That's what it is.
Hold on, because it's gonna get a lot worse after this.
It's like as Homer says to Bart, "This is the worst day of my life." Worst day of your life so far.
Yeah.
That's what Mladen Doler said in Slovenia. He said we all interpreted Reagan as some kind of anomaly from which the strength of the left would have to bounce back. And he said instead what we got, Reagan, Bush Sr., Bush Jr., Trump. And he said, I've reached a point where I'm very hesitant to wax optimistic about the possibility of some kind of dialectical pendulum swing taking hold, right?
Yeah.
We will see.
Yeah, we'll see.
We wrap it, guys?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very optimistic.
That was a long one, but we had a lot of stuff to go through. Thank you so much for tuning out. Sorry, or tuning in. That was a Freudian slip. Thank you so much for tuning in to Zero Books Basement, discussing capital. This was chapter 17. Next week, we will be discussing, as you may have discerned, our brilliant audience, chapter 18, different formulae for the rate of surplus value. And in the Penguin Folks edition of the text, that runs from page 668 to that runs from page 668 to 672. So not a very long chapter, about 4 pages. Hopefully won't be too intimidating for all of you to read. Thanks so much, guys.
Bye.
See ya.